Hello, Ranger Screams family. I hope you're all doing well. Thank you so much for your amazing support and all of your comments. They truly mean a lot to me. Before we begin, let's try to reach 2,000 likes and 2,000 comments on this video. Every like and comment helps the channel grow and reach more horror fans. If you're not subscribed yet, I'd love for you to join the Ranger Screams family by subscribing. Thank you for being here. And now let's begin tonight's story. The dispatch came through at 4:47 a.m., cutting through the pre-dawn silence of my ranger station like a rusted blade. In 23 years of service at Shoshone National Forest, I'd handled countless missing person reports, but this one carried a different weight. 3 hikers vanished from the Whisper Track trail system, a father and his 2 teenage sons from Denver. The Hartley family, Robert, 42, Michael, 17, and David, 15. Last seen 36 hours ago. I drained the bitter remnants of yesterday's coffee and pulled on my uniform, the fabric still damp from last night's patrol. The Whisper Track earned its name from the Arapaho people who first walked these paths centuries ago. They claimed the wind carried voices of those who'd wandered too far from the marked trails, speaking in languages both ancient and unborn. Most rangers dismissed it as folklore, but after 2 decades in these woods, I'd learned to respect what the indigenous peoples knew. My partner, Joseph Crowfeather, was already loading the search gear into our truck when I reached the parking area. A member of the Northern Arapaho tribe and 4th-generation ranger, Joseph had that particular stillness that comes from growing up with one foot in the modern world and another in traditions older than the trees around us. "Weather's turning," he said without looking up, securing the emergency medical kit. "Storm system moving in from the northwest. We've got maybe 8 hours before it hits." I studied the sky, still black but beginning to bruise purple at the edges. The air tasted metallic, charged with the promise of violence. The Hartley family, experienced hikers. First time on the Whisper Track, they were heading for Eagle's Crown, planning to camp at the Midway shelter. Joseph finally met my eyes, and I saw my own unease reflected there. Their car's still in the lot, all the gear they'd need for a 3-day trek. We drove in silence, headlights cutting through the darkness as we wound up the access road. The forest pressed close on either side, Douglas firs and lodgepole pines creating a tunnel of shadows. My radio crackled with updates from base. 2 other search teams would converge from different trailheads, but Joseph and I knew this section best. The Whisper Track trailhead parking area held only one vehicle, a blue Toyota 4Runner with Colorado plates. I ran the beam of my flashlight across the interior, maps spread on the dashboard, water bottles in the cup holders, a phone charger still plugged in. Everything suggested they'd planned to return. "Thomas checked the registration," Joseph said, referring to the night shift ranger. "Matched the Hartley family. He found something else too." From his pocket, Joseph produced an evidence bag containing what looked like a crude wooden carving, about the size of my thumb. The figure was roughly human-shaped but wrong somehow. Too many limbs, features that seemed to shift in the flashlight beam. "Where?" "Trail marker at mile 3, hanging from a leather cord." Joseph's jaw tightened. "My grandmother used to tell stories about these, called them Naiavohoe, warning totems. They mark places where the boundary grows thin." I'd worked with Joseph long enough to know when to take his cultural knowledge seriously. Boundary between what? Between what is and what shouldn't be. We geared up and practiced silence. GPS units, emergency beacons, first aid supplies, climbing equipment, and enough provisions for 48 hours. I also packed the less official items, a pouch of tobacco Joseph had blessed, iron railroad spikes from the 1800s, and a digital recorder that had captured unexplained sounds on previous searches. The trail began innocuously enough, a well-maintained path winding through stands of aspen and pine. Our boots crunched on frost-brittle grass as the sky lightened to a diseased yellow. Every 100 yards we called out for the Hartley family, our voices swallowed by the trees faster than they should have been. At mile marker 2, we found the first sign of passage. A granola bar wrapper caught on a thorn bush, the kind sold at the visitor center. The partial boot print nearby matched the size and tread pattern for civilian hiking boots. They'd made it this far at least. Joseph knelt beside the print, studying something I couldn't see. "There's another set of tracks here, barefoot, but..." He shook his head. "Too big, and the stride length is wrong." I documented everything with my camera while Joseph made castings of the prints. The barefoot impressions were nearly 14 inches long with a width that suggested incredible weight. The toes splayed oddly, more like fingers than anything that should be on a foot. But it was the depth that troubled me most. Whatever made these tracks was far heavier than any human. "Could be a hoax," I said, not believing it myself. "Someone trying to create their own Bigfoot legend." Joseph stood slowly, eyes scanning the tree line. These tracks are fresh, made after the last rain, which was yesterday afternoon, after the Hartleys went missing. We continued up the trail as dawn broke properly, painting the forest in shades of gray and green. The morning birds should have been singing by now, but the woods remained eerily quiet. Even our radio communications with base came through increasingly distorted, words fragmenting into static. At mile 3, we reached the marker where Thomas had found the wooden totem. The leather cord still dangled from the post, swaying despite the absence of wind. Joseph approached it carefully, producing a pair of eagle feathers from his pack. He whispered something in Arapaho before using the feathers to sweep the air around the marker. "What did you say?" I asked for permission to pass and promised we come in peace. He met my skeptical look with a shrug. "My grandmother's ways have kept me safe for 15 years on these trails. I'm not stopping now." The path beyond the marker felt different. The trees grew closer together, their branches forming a canopy so thick it might have still been night beneath them. The temperature dropped at least 10 degrees and our breath came out in visible puffs. Most disturbing was the sound, or lack thereof. Our footsteps made no noise on the packed earth, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. We found the second piece of evidence at mile 4, Michael Hartley's cell phone, the screen cracked but still functional. The last photo taken showed Robert and David posing by a distinctive rock formation. Timestamp, 2:17 p.m., 2 days ago. The background of the image made my blood run cold. There was a shadow among the trees that didn't match any of the surrounding vegetation. It stood upright, massive, with what might have been eyes reflecting the camera flash. "Jesus," I breathed, zooming in on the image. The shadow remained frustratingly indistinct, but its proportions were all wrong for a human. Joseph studied the photo over my shoulder. "They saw it. Look at David's face. He's looking past the camera, not at it." He was right. The younger boy's expression showed the beginning of alarm, his eyes focused on something behind whoever took the picture. We were dealing with more than just missing hikers. The radio crackled to life, making us both jump. Through the static, I heard bass trying to raise us, but the words came through garbled and strange, as if spoken underwater. I tried to respond, but my transmission bounced back as an echo that sounded like whispers in a language I didn't recognize. "We're in a dead zone," Joseph said, but his expression suggested he meant more than just radio interference. The trail split ahead, one path continuing toward Eagle's Crown, the other descending into a ravine marked "closed for restoration" on our maps. Fresh footprints led down the closed trail, 3 sets of hiking boots moving quickly, stumbling in places. The barefoot tracks followed, maintaining that impossibly long stride. "They were running," I said, reading the story in the disturbed earth. Something chased them off the main trail. Joseph had already started down the closed path, moving with the fluid grace of someone raised in wild places. I followed, every instinct screaming that we were making a mistake. The ravine walls rose around us, stone faces carved by ancient waters into shapes that looked almost deliberate. Petroglyphs appeared on some surfaces, spirals and stick figures that predated any known indigenous presence in the area. The smell hit us first, musky, animal, but underneath something else, copper and ozone, like the air before a lightning strike. Joseph held up a closed fist, the universal sign to stop. In the silence that followed, we heard it, breathing that wasn't ours, deep and rhythmic, coming from somewhere ahead. My hand moved to my sidearm, standard issue that had never been drawn in over 2 decades of service. Joseph shook his head slightly, instead reaching for the pouch of tobacco. He scattered a pinch on the ground, lips moving in what I recognized as a protection prayer. The breathing stopped. In the silence that followed, a new sound emerged, a child crying. David Hartley's voice, high and terrified, calling for his father. The sound came from deeper in the ravine, past a bend that would take us out of sight of the trail. Every horror movie I'd ever seen screamed at me not to follow that voice. But I'd taken an oath to protect and serve, and somewhere in these woods, a family needed help. Joseph and I exchanged a look that said everything. We both knew this was probably a trap, and we were walking into it anyway. The crying continued, sometimes David's voice, sometimes Michael's, always just around the next bend. We followed, noting how the footprints became more erratic, showing signs of panic. Blood appeared on some rocks, not much, but enough to confirm someone was injured. The ravine opened into a clearing that shouldn't have existed. My GPS showed solid cliff walls, but here was a circular space maybe 30 yards across, surrounded by stones stacked in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The Hartley family's camping gear lay scattered around the edges, torn sleeping bags, a shredded tent, food supplies ripped open and strewn about. But it was the center of the clearing that made me forget to breathe. The figure stood nearly 9 feet tall, covered in matted fur that shifted between brown and black as shadows played across its massive frame. Its face was almost human, almost, with intelligent eyes that held depths of awareness no animal should possess. Those eyes were fixed on us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. One massive hand rested on Michael Hartley's shoulder, not restraining but oddly protective. The teenager sat on the ground, conscious but dazed, a gash on his forehead still seeping blood. Behind the creature, partially hidden by its bulk, I could see Robert and David Hartley. The father cradled his younger son, who appeared unconscious but breathing. All three were alive, but their faces held the blank shock of those who'd seen something their minds couldn't process. Joseph stepped forward, hands visible and empty. He spoke in Arapaho, voice low and respectful. The creature's head tilted, listening. When Joseph finished, it responded, not in words, but in a series of low vocalizations that seemed to resonate in my chest cavity. Somehow, impossibly, Joseph seemed to understand. "It's not what we think," Joseph said quietly, never taking his eyes off the being. "It's a guardian. The boys disturbed something they shouldn't have. Something old and hungry. This one fought it off." As if to confirm Joseph's words, the creature stepped aside slightly, revealing deep gouges in the earth behind it. The marks looked like claw strikes, but from something with talons the length of my forearm. Dark stains on the rocks suggested the guardian hadn't emerged from the battle unscathed. Matted fur on its left side showed what might have been blood. "Mr. Hartley?" I called out, keeping my voice steady. "I'm Ranger Williams. We're here to help. Can you walk?" Robert Hartley blinked slowly, focus returning to his eyes. It saved us. There was something else, something that came out of the stones, like smoke but solid. It had teeth. His voice broke. The guardian made another low sound, almost gentle. It removed its hand from Michael's shoulder and stepped back, melting into the shadows at the edge of the clearing with surprising grace for something so large. But I could still feel its presence, watching. Joseph moved to examine the boys while I helped Robert to his feet. David was unconscious but stable, possible concussion from a fall. Michael's head wound needed stitches but wasn't life-threatening. The real damage was psychological. All three had the 1,000-yard stare of trauma victims. "We need to move," Joseph said urgently. "The boundary is still thin here. What attacked them might come back." I keyed my radio, surprised when base came through clear despite our location. "Base, this is Williams. We've located the Hartley family. 3 souls, all alive but injured, requesting immediate evacuation from grid reference." I paused, checking my GPS. The coordinates showed as corrupted data, symbols that didn't match any system I knew. "Williams, your position shows as invalid. Can you confirm location?" "Closed section of Whisper Track, approximately mile 5. Trail conditions are complicated. We're going to need the helicopter. Weather service shows that storm hitting earlier than expected. You've got maybe 2 hours before we're grounded. Can you make it back to the Eagle's Crown landing zone?" I looked at our injured hikers. David would need to be carried, and Michael could walk but slowly. The main trail was at least 3 miles back, then another 2 to the landing zone. In good conditions, maybe possible, but nothing about this felt like good conditions. "We'll make it," I said, projecting confidence I didn't feel. Joseph had already started breaking out the emergency litter for David. As we worked to secure the unconscious boy, Robert grabbed my arm. "You have to believe me," he whispered urgently. "We found a cave yesterday, just off the trail. Michael wanted to explore it. Inside were these drawings, old ones. They started moving, coming off the walls. That's when the first thing came, all shadow and teeth and hunger. We ran, but it followed. Then the big one appeared." He glanced toward where the guardian had vanished. "It fought the shadow thing, drove it back, but I don't think it's gone. I think it's waiting." I believed him. In 23 years of service, I'd seen enough to know the forests held secrets we were better off not knowing. But my job was to get them to safety, not to investigate paranormal encounters. "We're leaving now," I assured him. "Whatever happened, it's over. Let's focus on getting your boys to a hospital." We fashioned a carrying system for David using rescue equipment and our packs. Michael could walk with support. The journey back would be slow, but we had to try. As we prepared to leave the clearing, Joseph scattered more tobacco and spoke again in Arapaho. This time, I caught one word I recognized. "Thank you." From the shadows came an almost inaudible rumble that might have been acknowledgement. The return journey became a nightmare of endurance. The closed trail fought us every step. Roots seemed to shift underfoot, branches caught at the litter, and the path itself appeared to change when we weren't looking directly at it. Michael stumbled frequently, his concussion worse than we'd initially assessed. Robert pushed on with paternal determination, but exhaustion was taking its toll. Worse was the feeling of being followed. Not by the Guardian, its presence felt protective, staying just out of sight but somehow between us and whatever threatened from behind. No, something else stalked us. The shadows lengthened unnaturally, reaching across the trail like grasping fingers. The temperature continued to drop, ice forming on leaves that should have been warming in the morning sun. "Keep moving," Joseph urged, taking more of David's weight. "Don't look back. Don't acknowledge it." But I did look back once. The trail behind us was dark, darker than the forest canopy could account for. And in that darkness, something moved with too many angles, leaving frost-burned footprints that steamed in air that shouldn't have been cold enough for frost. Michael whimpered, pressing closer to his father. "It's coming back. The hungry thing. I can hear it whispering." So could I, though I tried to pretend otherwise. Words in no language ever spoken by human tongues, promises of emptiness and consumption. The kind of voice that could drive you mad if you listened too closely. Then the Guardian roared. The sound shook pine needles from the trees and sent birds exploding from cover a mile away. It was challenge and warning combined, primal fury given voice. The darkness behind us recoiled, and the whispering stopped. For a moment. "Move faster," Joseph commanded. And we did. We reached the main trail as the first fat raindrops began to fall. The transition was jarring. One moment we were in that nightmarish ravine. The next we stood on familiar ground with actual sunlight filtering through normal trees. My GPS flickered back to life, showing our real position. But we weren't safe yet. The storm was building fast, black clouds boiling over the mountains like smoke from some vast fire. Lightning flickered in the depths, and the wind picked up, carrying the ozone smell of electrical discharge. "Base, this is Williams," I called, rain already making it hard to hold the radio. "We're on Main Trail, heading for Eagle's Crown. Weather's deteriorating fast. Helicopters already en route, Williams. They'll wait as long as they can, but this storm's a monster. You need to hurry." We pushed harder, half carrying, half dragging our charges up the trail. The rain came in sheets now, turning the packed earth into treacherous mud. Lightning struck close enough that the thunder was instantaneous, the flash leaving purple afterimages in my vision. Michael stumbled and fell, crying out as his injured head struck a rock. "I've got him," Robert said, hauling his son upright with strength born of desperation. Blood mixed with rain on the boy's face, but his eyes were alert, focused on something behind us. "Dad, it's coming up the main trail. The shadow thing. I can see it moving between the trees." Joseph and I exchanged glances. We'd hoped the Guardian's presence would keep it confined to the closed area, but apparently whatever supernatural rules governed these encounters were more complex than we understood. "How far to the landing zone?" Joseph asked, adjusting his grip on David's litter. I checked the GPS, wiping rain from the screen. "Half a mile, maybe less." Thunder crashed again, so loud it felt like the mountain was splitting apart. In the brief, stark illumination of the lightning, I saw it. A darkness that moved independent of natural shadow, flowing up the trail like oil given malevolent purpose. Where it touched, plants withered and ice formed despite the rain. "Run," I said. We ran, or tried to. Running while carrying an unconscious teenager through a storm on a muddy mountain trail is nearly impossible, but terror is a powerful motivator. Robert half-dragged Michael, who was mumbling prayers or pleas. Joseph and I fought to keep David's litter stable as we slipped and slid up the incline. The helicopter's rotors became audible over the storm, a mechanical heartbeat that meant salvation. Through the trees ahead, I could see the clearing where the emergency landing zone had been carved from the forest. The aircraft hovered unsteadily, fighting gusts that threatened to dash it against the mountainside. Behind us, the darkness gained ground. I could hear it now, not whispering but a sound like tearing fabric, as if reality itself was being shredded by its passage. The temperature plummeted so fast my wet clothes began to stiffen with forming ice. "There," Joseph shouted, pointing to the clearing's edge. The helicopter's crew had already deployed, 2 medics with a rescue basket waiting at the tree line. We burst from the forest into the relative open of the landing zone, rain driving horizontally now in the rotor wash. "Load the injured first," I yelled over the noise, helping transfer David to the rescue basket. That's when the Guardian appeared again. It erupted from the forest behind us, placing itself between our group and the advancing darkness. In daylight, even storm dimmed, it was even more impressive and impossible. Muscle and sinew moved beneath dark fur in ways that suggested both ape and something else, something older. It planted its feet wide, faced the tree line, and released another bone-shaking roar. The helicopter crew froze. One medic reached for his sidearm before Joseph grabbed his wrist. "No, it's protecting us. Just get the family loaded." To their credit, the crew recovered quickly. David was hoisted up, followed by Michael, who needed assistance climbing. Robert hesitated at the basket, looking back at us. "What about you?" "Next trip," I lied. "Go." He climbed in, and the basket rose. The helicopter was already fighting to maintain position, the pilot's skill the only thing keeping it from being smashed into the mountain by the wind. The darkness reached the clearing's edge, and stopped, held back by the Guardian's presence, but I could see the massive creature weakening, wounds from its earlier battle seeping fresh blood. It couldn't hold forever. "Base, this is Williams," I radioed. "Hartley family is secure. Crowfeather and I need immediate extraction." "Negative, Williams. Pilot says he's at limit. Has to bug out now or risk losing the aircraft. Second bird is grounded until storm passes." I looked at Joseph, saw my own understanding reflected in his eyes. We were trapped here with whatever nightmare had crawled out of the deep forest. The helicopter peeled away, fighting for altitude as it disappeared into the storm. The sound of its rotors faded, leaving us with only rain, thunder, and the low growl emanating from the Guardian's chest. "The Ranger cabin," Joseph said suddenly. "Echo station. It's a quarter-mile east, built on old sacred ground." I knew the cabin, a reinforced structure used for emergency shelter and equipment storage. More importantly, Joseph's grandmother had once told him it sat on what the Arapaho called quiet earth, places where spiritual forces were naturally dampened. "Can we make it?" The darkness was spreading along the clearing's perimeter, trying to flank the Guardian. The creature split its attention, turning to face multiple threats. Its movements were slowing, exhaustion and blood loss taking their toll. "We have to try," Joseph said. He reached into his pack, pulling out a leather bundle I'd seen him prepare but never use. "When I say run, we run. Don't stop, don't look back." He unwrapped the bundle, revealing what looked like a mixture of herbs, crystals, and small bones. The moment it was exposed to air, the darkness recoiled slightly. Even the rain seemed to avoid falling on it. Joseph began to chant in Arapaho, his voice somehow carrying over the storm. He cast the mixture in a wide arc between us and the darkness. Where it landed, small fires sparked despite the downpour, burning with colors that shouldn't exist. "Now! Run!" We ran east along a game trail, branches tearing at our uniforms, rain blinding us. Behind us I heard the Guardian roar one more time, not in challenge but in pain. The sound cut off abruptly, and I forced myself not to think about what that meant. The darkness shrieked, a sound like metal tearing mixed with hungry wailing. Joseph's barrier had bought us moments, not minutes. I could hear it pursuing, no longer held back by the Guardian's presence. Echo Station appeared through the rain like a solid shadow, its log walls dark with moisture. I fumbled with my keys, hands numb from cold, finally getting the reinforced door open. We stumbled inside, slamming it shut and throwing the heavy bar lock. The cabin was basic, 2 rooms, emergency supplies, a radio setup, and, thankfully, a wood stove. Joseph immediately began pulling things from the shelves, creating a barrier of salt and iron filings at the door and windows. I worked on getting a fire started, knowing hypothermia would kill us as surely as any supernatural threat. Outside, something struck the door hard enough to shake the entire structure. The sound that followed was worse, scratching, as if countless fingers were trying to find purchase on the wet logs. The whispers returned, seeping through the walls despite Joseph's protections. "Will the barriers hold?" I asked, feeding kindling into the stove. "Maybe. This place was built on a vision site. The old ones used to come here to seek clarity." Joseph's hands shook as he reinforced the salt lines. Spirits have a harder time manifesting on neutral ground. Another impact, this time against the shuttered window. Frost spread across the glass in impossible patterns, forming shapes that hurt to look at. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They spoke of cold spaces between stars, of hunger that had existed before the first spark of life, of the emptiness that waited to swallow all warmth and light. "Don't listen," Joseph warned, pressing his hands to his ears. "That's how it gets in. Through the mind first, then the body." But it was hard not to listen when the voices began to sound familiar. I heard my ex-wife calling my name, telling me to open the door. My daughter's laugh, even though she lived 3 states away. The voices of lost hikers I'd never found, pleading for rescue. The fire finally caught, casting flickering light through the cabin. In that warm glow, the whispers seemed to fade slightly. I added more wood, building the flames higher. Fire, I said, understanding dawning. It doesn't like fire. Or light, or warmth, or life. Joseph agreed. It's from the cold dark, the empty spaces. That's why the Guardian could fight it. They're opposites. Life force against entropy. We spent the next hour reinforcing our defenses. Every lamp and candle in the cabin was lit. I found road flares in the emergency supplies and set them aside as weapons of last resort. Joseph continued his protective rituals, burning sage and sweetgrass until the air was thick with sacred smoke. The attacks came in waves, sometimes physical, impacts that cracked logs and bent metal fixtures, sometimes psychological, voices of loved ones, visions in the frost patterns, promises of peace if we just stepped outside. The worst were the moments of silence when we could feel it thinking, probing for weaknesses. My radio's getting something, Joseph said suddenly. I checked my own unit. Through the static came a transmission in Arapaho. Joseph listened intently, then smiled for the first time since we'd found the Hartleys. It's my grandmother. She says the tribal council felt the disturbance. They're performing the old ceremonies, calling on the mountain spirits for aid. As if in response, the darkness outside shrieked in fury. But now there was something else in that sound. Frustration, maybe even fear. The attacks on the cabin intensified, desperate now rather than methodical. Then, between one heartbeat and the next, everything stopped. The silence was so absolute it felt like pressure in my ears. No rain on the roof, no wind against the walls, no whispers seeking cracks in our minds. Joseph and I stood frozen, afraid to move, afraid to hope. A knock came at the door. 3 measured raps, perfectly spaced. Rangers? This is Chief Yazzie with Arapaho Emergency Services. The storm's passed. You boys all right in there? I looked at Joseph, who held up a hand for caution. Ask him something only he would know, he whispered. Chief, I called out. What did you say to me at last year's joint training exercise? About my coffee? A chuckle came through the door. Said it was strong enough to wake the ancestors and weak enough to disappoint them. Now open up. We've got hot food and dry blankets. It was him. We unbarred the door to find a dozen members of the tribal police and emergency services, along with Joseph's grandmother, a woman who looked ancient but moved with surprising vitality. The storm had indeed passed, leaving crystal-clear skies with stars just beginning to appear. The shadow hunger has been driven back, the old woman said, examining our salt barriers with approval, for now. But it will remember this place, these people. The boundary was torn and such wounds heal slowly. What about the Guardian? I asked. The creature that protected the Hartleys? She smiled sadly. The old protector returned to the deep woods, wounded but alive. Your offerings of tobacco and respect were noted. It has been long since the new people showed proper courtesy. As we gathered our gear to leave, I noticed something carved into a tree near the cabin. Fresh marks in a pattern that matched the petroglyphs we'd seen in the ravine. But these felt different, protective rather than ominous. Guardian marking, Joseph confirmed. We're under its protection now, both a blessing and a responsibility. The evacuation was efficient, professional. Within an hour we were back at base, giving our reports to increasingly skeptical supervisors. The official story would be simple. Hikers lost in storm, injured in fall, rescued by rangers. No mention of shadows with teeth, guardians in the woods, or boundaries between worlds worn thin. But that night, as I sat in my apartment trying to write my real report, the one that would go in my personal files, my phone rang. Robert Hartley, calling from the hospital. Ranger Williams? I wanted to thank you again. And to tell you something. David woke up. He says he dreamed about the big creature. It spoke to him, in the dream. Told him the shadow thing was very old, very hungry, but not evil. Just empty, looking to fill itself with life and warmth. It said there are more out there, sleeping in deep places, and the Guardians have always stood watch. Did it say anything else? A pause. It said the barriers are weakening. What protected our ancestors might not protect our children. It said people like you and your partner need to remember the old agreements, keep the treaties our kind has forgotten. His voice dropped. I don't know what that means, but I thought you should know. I thanked him and ended the call, staring at my half-written report. Outside my window, the lights of the city glowed against the darkness, keeping the night at bay. But I knew now that darkness was more than just the absence of light. It was a living thing, patient and hungry, waiting for the barriers to fall. My phone buzzed with a text from Joseph. Grandmother wants to teach us the old ways, the real ranger training. You interested? I looked at the photo still on my computer. The the shadow in the trees behind the Hartley boys, the thing that shouldn't exist but did. Then I thought about all the missing hikers over the years, the ones we never found. How many had encountered things like this? How many guardians still stood watch in the deep woods? I texted back, yes. Because someone had to keep watch. Someone had to remember the agreements. And after what I'd seen in those woods, I knew my real education was just beginning. 3 weeks after the Hartley incident, I found myself sitting cross-legged on the packed earth floor of a traditional Arapaho lodge, smoke from the sacred fire making my eyes water. Joseph sat to my right, his grandmother Elizabeth Crowfeather across from us. The old woman's face was a map of deep lines and decades of wisdom, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight as she prepared to speak. Your government made treaties with my people, she began, her voice carrying the weight of generational memory. Papers and promises about land and resources, but there were older agreements, made long before your ancestors crossed the Great Water. Agreements between the first humans to walk these mountains and the things that were already here. She passed a leather pouch to Joseph, who took a pinch of tobacco and added it to the fire before passing it to me. The smoke curled up through the lodge's smoke hole, carrying our offerings to whatever listened. The new Numbi, Elizabeth continued, using the old word, the first inhabitants. Some became the guardians, protectors of the sacred places. Others, she paused, choosing her words carefully. Others chose different paths, hungry paths, dark paths. Our ancestors learned to recognize the signs, to maintain the boundaries, to honor the agreements that kept both worlds in balance. A younger man entered the lodge, Thomas White Eagle, game warden and, I learned, keeper of certain traditional knowledge. He nodded to us before taking his place in the circle. Last month's disturbance wasn't isolated, Thomas said without preamble. We've had reports from the Wind River region. Cattle found, turned inside out. Hunters disappearing in areas they've known all their lives. And the petroglyphs. He produced a tablet, incongruous in the traditional setting, showing photographs. These appeared overnight at 7 different sites. The images showed similar symbols to what we'd seen in the ravine, but fresh, as if burned into the rock. They hurt to look at directly, seeming to writhe on the screen. Warning markers, Elizabeth interpreted. Something is waking the old hungers. The barriers weaken when people forget their purpose, when the proper ceremonies aren't performed, when the guardians stand alone. She fixed me with those penetrating eyes. You saw one of them, the guardian. It chose to reveal itself to save those boys, but that choice came with a cost. Every time they directly intervene in our world, they lose some of their connection to the spirit realm, become more physical, more vulnerable. How many are there? I asked. Few enough, Thomas answered. Maybe a dozen in all the Rocky Mountains. They're not reproductive in any sense we understand. When one falls, no new guardian rises to take its place. Joseph stirred the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. My grandmother has been teaching me the signs, places where the boundaries thin, where crossing over becomes possible. The whisper track is one of the strongest, but there are others. The rangers need to know these places, need to understand what they're really protecting. Elizabeth reached into a worn bag beside her, producing a rolled hide covered in symbols and rough maps. This is a copy of the Treaty of the First Light, as my grandmother's grandmother remembered it. Not written in any language your universities would recognize, but binding nonetheless. I studied the hide, trying to make sense of the pictographs. Stylized figures that might have been human stood beside larger shapes, some clearly meant to represent the guardians. Between them were symbols of exchange, offerings given and received, boundaries marked and respected. The agreement was simple, Elizabeth explained. Humans could live in these lands, hunt, build, raise families. In exchange, we would remember, keep the stories, perform the ceremonies, feed the sacred fires, and when the dark things stirred, we would stand with the guardians to drive them back. But people forgot, Thomas added bitterly. Your people came with new gods, new ways, called our stories superstition, banned our ceremonies, built roads through sacred sites, dammed rivers that were meant to flow free. And with each violation the boundaries weakened. A howl echoed from somewhere outside. Not wolf, not quite. Everyone in the lodge tensed. That's why we need rangers who remember, Elizabeth said calmly, as if supernatural howls were just another evening sound. The Park Service has jurisdiction, resources, authority. But more than that, people trust rangers. When you speak, they listen. When you mark a trail as dangerous, they find another path. She stood with surprising grace and beckoned us to follow. Outside, the night was crisp with autumn chill. The stars seemed especially bright, unmarred by light pollution. We followed a narrow path up a hillside to a flat stone outcropping that overlooked the valley. This is a watching place, Elizabeth explained. My grandfather's grandfather would come here to monitor the boundaries. Look, with different eyes. She showed us how to unfocus our vision slightly, to pay attention to peripheral movement, to notice where shadows fell wrongly. At first I saw nothing unusual. Then, gradually, the landscape began to reveal its secrets. Faint lines of light, like aurora borealis brought to Earth, marked certain ridgelines and valleys. Some glowed soft blue-white, others pulsed an angry red. Where the lines intersected, the air itself seemed to shimmer. Jesus, I breathed. The spirit roads, Joseph said quietly. I'm starting to see them too. The white lines are neutral paths, safe for both worlds. The red, Elizabeth's expression darkened. Those are the hungry roads, where the shadow things travel, where the boundaries have been torn and never properly mended. One red line ran directly through the area where we'd rescued the Hartleys. Thomas pulled out a modern GPS device modified with additional sensors. We've been mapping these for the past 5 years, correlating them with missing persons reports, unusual wildlife behavior, electromagnetic anomalies. The overlap is significant. Why hasn't this been reported to federal authorities? I asked, though I suspected the answer. We tried, Thomas said flatly. Filed reports with Park Service, FBI, anyone who would listen. They created a file, did a cursory investigation, concluded we were seeing patterns and coincidence, easier to dismiss than to acknowledge that their entire worldview might be incomplete. A scream echoed across the valley, human enough to raise goosebumps, but with undertones that suggested a throat not shaped for human speech. Elizabeth calmly reached into her pouch and scattered something into the wind. The sound cut off abruptly. The Hartley boy who disturbed the cave, she said, returning to our lesson as if nothing had happened. He broke one of the oldest rules, never enter a marked sanctuary without permission. The Guardians create these spaces to contain things that shouldn't be free. When the boy crossed that threshold, he gave the shadow hunger a pathway into our world. But it's been driven back, Joseph said. The Guardian fought it off. His grandmother shook her head slowly. Driven back, not destroyed. These things don't die as we understand death. They return to the cold spaces, nurse their wounds, and wait. And each time they manifest, they learn, adapt. The next encounter will be different. We spent the next 3 hours learning to read the spirit roads, to recognize the subtle signs of boundary weaknesses. Elizabeth taught us protection ceremonies, not the Hollywood version with dramatic chanting and special effects, but quiet, focused rituals that reinforced the barriers between worlds. Salt and iron were tools, she explained, but intent was the true power. Believing in the boundaries made them stronger. As we prepared to leave, Thomas pulled me aside. There's something else. Reports from other states, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado. Similar incidents, increasing frequency. It's not just here. Something is stirring up the old hungers across the entire range. Any theories? He glanced at Elizabeth, who nodded permission. Climate change is part of it. The old ice is melting, releasing things that have been frozen for millennia. But there's more. Construction projects disturbing burial sites. Mining operations breaking into sealed caverns, and, he hesitated. There are people actively seeking these things out, calling themselves researchers or cryptozoologists, but their methods suggest darker purposes. Cultists? The word felt absurd even as I said it. We don't know. But last year we found an abandoned camp near Medicine Bow. They'd constructed a summoning circle using instructions they'd pieced together from corrupted versions of our stories. The amount of blood suggested they'd succeeded in calling something, but there were no bodies. Just clothes and equipment left behind. Elizabeth rejoined us, pressing small leather pouches into our hands. Protection bundles. Wear them always when you're in the deep woods. They won't stop a determined attack, but they'll make you less interesting to the shadow things. As Joseph and I drove back down the mountain, he was unusually quiet. Finally, as we reached the main highway, he spoke. My grandmother didn't tell you everything. There's a prophecy among our people. When the Guardians begin to reveal themselves to outsiders, when the shadow hungers grow bold enough to hunt in daylight, it means the final agreement is approaching. Final agreement? A choice. Between worlds. Between ways of being. The barriers won't hold forever. They were never meant to. Eventually, humanity will have to decide. Learn to coexist with the new Numbi, both light and shadow, or face a war we're not equipped to fight. My phone buzzed with an emergency dispatch. Another missing hiker, this time in the Bridger-Teton forest. Single male, experienced outdoorsman, vanished from a well-traveled trail. Last photo he'd sent to his wife showed something tall moving between the trees behind him. When do we start teaching the other rangers? I asked. Joseph almost smiled. Tomorrow. Grandmother has already spoken to Chief Yazzie. He's arranging a joint training exercise, official cover for what we really need to teach them. As we drove through the darkness, I found myself studying the shadows between the trees differently. Not with fear, exactly, but with the awareness that comes from knowing you're not alone in the wilderness, that you never were. My radio crackled with updates about the missing hiker. Search teams were being organized for first light. I wondered if we'd find him, or if he'd become another statistic, another file in the archive of the unexplained. But now, at least, some of us knew the truth. And maybe, if we could teach enough rangers, game wardens, and tribal officers the old ways, maybe we could strengthen the boundaries enough to hold, at least for a while. The protection bundle felt warm against my chest, a small comfort in the face of vast uncertainty. Whatever was coming, humanity wouldn't face it blind. The Guardians had kept watch for millennia. Now it was our turn to stand vigil. The call came at 3 a.m., 6 weeks after my training with Elizabeth Crowfeather. Sheriff Patricia Chen's voice was steady, but I could hear the underlying tension. "Williams, I need you and Crowfeather at the old Dutchman mine. We've got a situation. Bring your special equipment." The special equipment was code for the tools and knowledge Joseph and I had been quietly accumulating. Iron spikes blessed by tribal elders, salt from sacred lakes, and most importantly, the modified electromagnetic field detectors that Thomas White Eagle had developed to track Spirit Road activity. The Dutchman mine sat high in the Absaroka Range, abandoned since the 1950s after a series of accidents that killed 17 miners. Local folklore blamed a cave-in that had broken into something that shouldn't have been disturbed, but the mining company's records were conveniently lost in a fire. We arrived to find a scene of controlled chaos. Multiple law enforcement vehicles, an ambulance, and, surprisingly, 3 black SUVs with government plates but no agency markings. Sheriff Chen met us at the perimeter, her usually composed face showing strain. "Started with a missing persons report," she explained, leading us up the rough trail. 5 college students from Colorado State said they were doing geological research. We found their camp yesterday. Then we found this. The mine entrance had been cleared of decades of debris. Fresh tool marks showed careful, deliberate excavation. But it was what lay beyond that made my blood run cold. The students had constructed a ritual circle using what looked like pages torn from old books, bones that were definitely not from any local wildlife, and symbols carved into the mine support beams that hurt to look at directly. "Where are the students?" Joseph asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. Chen pointed to the ambulance. 2 survivors, catatonic. The other 3? She gestured deeper into the mine. "You need to see for yourself." We suited up with headlamps and breathing gear. As we entered the mine, our modified EMF detectors immediately began registering anomalies. The spirit roads here weren't just visible, they were practically screaming, pulsing with sick red light that made the shadows dance. 50 feet in, we found the first body, or what remained of it. The student had been turned inside out with mathematical precision, every organ and bone arranged in patterns that suggested both purpose and malevolent intelligence. The second body was fused into the rock wall, as if the stone had become liquid just long enough to absorb them. The third, "Don't touch anything," a new voice commanded. A woman in tactical gear emerged from a side passage, her equipment bearing no insignia but clearly military grade. "Agent Sarah Reeves, Division 7, will be taking jurisdiction here." Division 7? I'd never heard of it. Her smile was humorless. "Officially, we don't exist. Unofficially, we clean up messes like this. Dr. Crowfeather, your grandmother's reports have been very helpful to our research." Joseph stiffened. "My grandmother would never." "Relax, we're not the enemy. We've been monitoring situations like this for decades. The intersection of ancient knowledge and modern stupidity. These kids found something online, fragments of the Thula Society's work from the 1930s, mixed with corrupted Native American mysticism and their own half-assed interpretations. They thought they could summon and control one of the new Numbi." She led us deeper into the mine, where her team was documenting the scene with equipment I didn't recognize. The third student's remains were the worst, scattered across 100 feet of tunnel, each piece showing signs of having been somewhere else before returning. Somewhere very cold and very dark. "They succeeded in opening a door," Reeves continued. "But doors work both ways. The shadow hunger they called didn't come alone. Our sensors indicate at least 3 entities crossed over before the portal collapsed." "3?" Joseph's voice was sharp. "Where are they now?" Reeves pulled out a tablet showing a topographical map overlaid with energy readings. 3 distinct signatures moved away from the mine in different directions, one toward the nearest town, another deeper into the wilderness, and the third. Heading for Yellowstone, I said, reading the trajectory. Toward the highest concentration of tourists in a 3-state area. Now you understand why we're here, Reeves gestured to her team. We're trackers, not fighters. That's where you come in. We need people who understand both the terrain and the entities. Your unique training makes you valuable assets. I wanted to refuse, to say this was beyond our job description. But I thought of families camping in Yellowstone, unaware that something ancient and hungry was moving toward them through the shadow roads. What do you need us to do? Joseph asked. Help us hunt. Each entity will be drawn to different prey. The one heading to town will seek isolated individuals. It feeds on fear and isolation. The wilderness-bound one will likely establish a territory, corrupting the local spirit roads. But the Yellowstone one, she frowned, that one's exhibiting unusual behavior, almost intelligent, purposeful. We spent the next hour being briefed on Division 7's protocols and equipment. They had weapons, not guns, but devices that disrupted electromagnetic fields in ways that could supposedly harm spirit entities. They had containment units that looked like high-tech versions of the soul jars from mythology. Most importantly, they had experience. We've been tracking increase in these events for the past 18 months, Reeves explained as we prepared to deploy. Someone is distributing summoning instructions online, hidden in archaeological forums and occult websites. Always incomplete, always corrupted just enough to ensure disaster. We think it's deliberate. Someone wants these barriers broken. The hunt began at sunset. Joseph and I joined the team pursuing the Yellowstone-bound entity. Our knowledge of backcountry trails invaluable. We moved in 3 vehicles, sensors tracking the signature as it moved with impossible speed through terrain that should have been impassable. It's following the old roads, Joseph observed, studying the readings. The paths between worlds. It knows exactly where it's going. We intercepted it near Heart Lake, a backcountry area requiring permits for access. The entity had stopped moving, which worried Reeves more than its previous rapid travel. We approached on foot, weapons ready, protection ceremonies whispered under our breath. The scene we found defied explanation. The entity, a writhing mass of shadow and teeth and angles that shouldn't exist, stood in the center of a natural stone circle. Around it, arranged with deliberate care, were offerings. Dead animals, yes, but also flowers, crystals, and what looked like handwritten notes. Someone had been feeding it, worshipping it. Contact, Reeves whispered into her radio. We have cultist activity. Repeat, the summoning was not accidental. Someone's been preparing for this. Movement in the trees revealed them. At least a dozen people in outdoor gear that would have looked normal on any hiking trail. Men and women of various ages, all wearing the same expression of fanatic devotion. They emerged from hiding spots with hands raised, not in surrender but in supplication toward the entity. The sleeping god wakes, one called out, his voice ecstatic. The barriers fall. The new age rises. The entity pulsed, growing larger. The offerings were fuel, I realized. Each death, each tribute made it stronger, more anchored to our reality. These people hadn't just summoned it, they were trying to make it permanent. Stand down, Reeves commanded. You're under arrest for… The cultists laughed, in unison. The sound was wrong, as if dozens of throats were making it, not just the 12 visible figures. Then they began to change. Their skin rippled like water, features shifting into something between human and not. The shadow entity had been feeding them too, transforming them into hybrids that could exist in both worlds. When they moved, they flickered between positions like badly spliced film. The battle was chaos. Division 7's weapons disrupted the hybrids but didn't stop them. Our iron spikes and salt barriers slowed them but couldn't contain something that was part human. Joseph began chanting in Arapaho, calling on the mountain spirits for aid, while I focused on keeping the cultists from completing whatever ritual they'd started. Then the Guardian appeared. Different from the one that had saved the Hartleys, older, more bare than ape, with scars that spoke of centuries of battle. It erupted from the forest with a roar that shattered the cultists' unison, breaking whatever hive mind connected them. The shadow entity recoiled, recognizing an ancient enemy. The treaties hold, Joseph shouted in English and Arapaho. By the agreements of the First Light, we call on the Guardians. Aid us. The battle became 3-sided. Division 7 and the Rangers fighting the cultists, the Guardian engaging the shadow entity, and somewhere in the chaos, more cultists arriving as reinforcements. They'd been waiting for this, planning it. The 5 college students had been pawns, expendable resources to open the initial breach. I found myself separated from the group, pursuing two cultists who were trying to complete a smaller ritual circle. They moved with inhuman speed, but I'd learned to read the spirit roads. I anticipated their flickering movements, herding them away from their goal. One turned to face me, and I recognized him, Dr. Marcus Webb, a respected archaeologist who'd written papers on Native American mythology. His eyes were pools of starlight darkness now, his smile too wide for his face. "You can't stop what's coming, Ranger Williams," he said, his voice layered with harmonics. "The old world is ending. The barriers were never meant to be permanent. We're simply accelerating the inevitable." "Why?" I demanded, keeping my iron spike ready. "What could you possibly gain?" "Transformation. Evolution. The new Numbi aren't invaders. They're the next step. Humanity's too limited, too bound by physical laws. We've found a way to transcend." He lunged, moving through space in ways that violated physics, but Elizabeth Crowfeather had taught me well. I didn't try to track his movement with my eyes. I felt for the disturbance in the spirit roads, the ripples his passage created. My spike found its mark, piercing through his shifted form. Dr. Webb screamed, the sound fracturing into multiple voices. Where the iron touched him, his hybrid nature unraveled. The human and shadow parts separated violently, tearing him apart from the inside. What fell to the ground was neither man nor monster, but something worse, a reminder of what happened when boundaries were crossed carelessly. The main battle was turning. The Guardian, despite its age and scars, fought with primal fury. Each blow disrupted the shadow entity's form, forcing it to expend energy to maintain cohesion. Division 7's weapons, combined with Joseph's ceremonies, were containing the remaining cultists. But victory came with revelations. In the aftermath, as we cataloged evidence and treated wounds, we discovered the true scope of the conspiracy. The cultists carried sophisticated equipment, satellite phones, encrypted tablets, and what appeared to be corporate ID badges from various tech companies, universities, and government contractors. "This is bigger than we thought," Reeves said, examining a recovered tablet. "They call themselves the Threshold Collective, members embedded in institutions worldwide, all working toward the convergence. Look at this." She showed us a map marking locations across North America, each with dates and phases. The Yellowstone summoning was just one of dozens planned. Some had already occurred, explained away as gas leaks, mass hallucinations, or simple disappearances. Others were scheduled for the coming months. Joseph knelt beside the Guardian, who sat exhausted against a boulder. The massive creature's breathing was labored, dark blood seeping from multiple wounds. My partner spoke softly in Arapaho, offering thanks and apologies. The Guardian's eyes, so disturbingly intelligent, fixed on him with something like acknowledgement before it limped back into the forest. "Will it survive?" I asked. "Perhaps, but each battle weakens them. They're finite, while the shadow hungers can always return." Joseph's face was grim. "We need to warn the other sacred sites. If the collective is coordinating attacks..." A scream interrupted him. One of the captured cultists was convulsing, her body rippling between forms. Reeves tried to administer a sedative, but the woman's skin phased through the needle. Then she spoke, but not with her own voice. It was the sound of the void between stars. "You delay nothing. The sleepers wake in Chile, in Siberia, in Tibet. The walls grow thin, your guardians fall, your treaties expire. The convergence comes." The woman's body collapsed into itself, leaving only empty clothes and a smell like burnt ozone. The other captured cultists smiled in unison, then bit down on something hidden in their mouths. Within seconds, they too dissolved, denying us any chance at interrogation. "Cyanide?" I asked. "No," Reeves said, scanning the remains. "Something that severed their connection to this reality. They've gone somewhere we can't follow." We spent the next 12 hours in crisis mode. The two other entities from the mine were tracked and contained, though not without casualties. The town-bound one had killed 3 people before Division 7 cornered it in an abandoned warehouse. The wilderness entity had begun corrupting a section of forest, turning it into something alien. Both required Guardian intervention to fully neutralize. By dawn, I found myself in a command center hastily established in a Park Service building. Maps covered every wall, showing spirit road networks across the continent. Red pins marked confirmed collective activity. There were far too many pins. "We need to go public," I argued. "Warn people. The more who know the truth, the more who'll try to summon these things," Reeves countered. "The collective recruits from believers. Every reveal risks creating more cultists. We've run the scenarios. Public disclosure leads to chaos, mass summoning attempts, and accelerated convergence." Thomas White Eagle entered, accompanied by Elizabeth Crowfeather, and other tribal elders I didn't recognize. They looked exhausted but determined. "The council has made a decision," Elizabeth announced. "We will teach any who wish to learn the old protections, not publicly but through trusted networks, rangers, conservation officers, rural law enforcement. Build a quiet army of those who guard the borders." "It won't be enough," Reeves said. "The collective has resources, government connections. They're not just fanatics. They're organized, funded, and believe they're saving humanity by transforming it." "Then we need our own organization," Joseph said. "Formal structure, resources, authority." Over the next hours, the framework took shape. Division 7 would provide federal backing and equipment. The tribal councils would share traditional knowledge and train personnel. Park services across multiple states would integrate new protocols under the guise of environmental protection. We were building a shadow organization to fight a shadow war. I was assigned to coordinate the Ranger training program. My decades of service and recent crash course in the supernatural made me an ideal liaison. Joseph would work with tribal authorities to identify and protect sacred sites. Others were tasked with intelligence gathering, trying to penetrate the collective's operations. As the meeting concluded, Elizabeth pulled me aside. "There's something else, something I didn't share with the others. The convergence the cultists speak of. It's not just about the shadow hungers crossing over. It's about what happens to humanity when the barriers fall completely." "What do you mean?" "The Nunmambi aren't invaders. They're native to Earth, just to a different phase of it. When the barriers collapse, both phases will merge. Humans not prepared for the transition will be torn apart by existing in two realities simultaneously. The collective believes their hybrid transformation will let them survive. They may be right. Then we need to find a different solution, a way to strengthen the barriers permanently, or help humanity adapt without losing ourselves to the shadow." She smiled sadly. "That's why the Guardians revealed themselves to you. They see something in humanity worth preserving. But salvation won't come from fighting alone. It will require understanding, compromise, evolution without corruption." A month later, I stood before a classroom of 20 rangers from across the Rocky Mountain region. My official title was Special Environmental Hazards Coordinator, a bureaucratic nothing that gave me authority to teach what needed teaching. "Forget everything you think you know about the natural world," I began, activating a projector showing spirit roadmaps. "You're about to learn that natural is a much broader category than you imagined, and your job just became much more complicated." Some looked skeptical, others fearful. A few showed the gleam of recognition. They'd seen things, experienced things, but never had context for them. These would be my best students. The forests we protect aren't just trees and wildlife. They're boundaries, barriers, and right now, something is trying very hard to tear those barriers down. We're going to learn how to stop them. I thought of the Hartley family, traumatized but alive because a guardian chose to act. I thought of the cultists dissolving into nothing, so committed to their cause they'd abandoned humanity entirely. I thought of the shadow entity's promise that convergence was coming regardless of our efforts. Maybe it was, but that didn't mean we'd face it unprepared. The old treaties might be expiring, but new ones could be written. The Guardians had kept watch for millennia. Now it was humanity's turn to prove we were worth their sacrifice. "Let's begin with the basics," I said, pulling out a pouch of salt and iron filings. "Protection circles and why they work." Outside, storm clouds gathered over the mountains. In the distance, something howled. Not wolf, not wind, but something in between. My students tensed, but I smiled. Good. They were already learning to listen. 6 months after forming our shadow organization, the signs became impossible to ignore. Wildlife migrations shifted without explanation. Compasses spun wildly in areas that had been magnetically stable for centuries. Most disturbing were the reports from remote communities. Entire families found catatonic, their eyes reflecting stars from skies that didn't match our own. I was reviewing incident reports in my office when Joseph burst in, face grave. "Williams, we need to go, now." Elizabeth had a vision. We drove through a spring storm toward the reservation, lightning illuminating the mountains in stark relief. The spirit roads were visible without trying now, pulsing like infected veins across the landscape. Even people with no training were beginning to notice. Calls about strange lights and impossible shadows had increased tenfold. Elizabeth Crowfeather sat in her lodge surrounded by other elders, their combined age representing centuries of accumulated wisdom. The old woman looked frailer than I'd ever seen her, but her eyes burned with urgent purpose. "I've seen what's coming," she said without preamble. "The final convergence. Not in years or months, but days. The collective has found the first seal." Thomas White Eagle spread a map on the ground, not a modern one, but a recreation of ancient knowledge, showing sites of power across the continent. The first seal is the oldest barrier, created when the world was young. It's what separated the phases of reality in the beginning. If they break it, all barriers fall at once, Joseph finished. Worldwide. Instantaneous convergence. Where is it? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Elizabeth pointed to a location in central Wyoming. Under Devil's Tower. The formation you see is just the cap. The seal extends miles underground. The collective has been excavating in secret, using mining permits and archaeological exemptions. My phone buzzed with an emergency alert from Reeves. The message was brief. Multiple breaches detected. Division 7 mobilizing. Prepare for worst case. The next 72 hours blurred together in a chaos of preparation and movement. Our network activated. Rangers, tribal warriors, Division 7 operatives, and even former cultists who'd rejected the collective's vision of forced evolution. We converged on Devil's Tower from all directions, a ragtag army preparing to fight for humanity's survival. The collective had been busy. The area around the tower was riddled with excavations, boreholes that descended into darkness. Strange machinery hummed with energies that made reality fluctuate. Workers moved with the jerky motions of the partially transformed, their humanity slipping away with each passing hour. Defensive positions are here, here, and here. Reeves pointed at a tactical map. They know we're coming. They're accelerating the timeline. As if to emphasize her point, the ground shook. Not an earthquake, something deeper. The tower itself groaned, stress fractures appearing in the ancient stone. Through the cracks leaked light that wasn't light, darkness that wasn't darkness. How long? I asked. Our best estimate? 18 hours before they reached the first seal. We attacked at dusk. 3 coordinated strikes aimed at disrupting their operation long enough for our specialists to reinforce the barriers. I led a team of rangers trained in both combat and ceremony, Joseph at my side with traditional weapons blessed by the elders. The battle was unlike anything in human warfare. Reality itself became fluid at the breach points. Collective soldiers phased in and out of existence, striking from angles that shouldn't exist. Shadow entities poured from the excavations, hungry and disoriented. Our iron weapons and protection circles held them back, but barely. Then the Guardians came. Not 1 or 2, but dozens. Every remaining Guardian in North America had felt the threat to the first seal. They emerged from forests and mountains, from hidden valleys and sacred caves. Bears and apes and things with no earthly analog, all united in purpose. The one who'd saved the Hartleys was among them, scarred but determined. The collective's leader revealed himself, not Dr. Webb, who I'd killed months ago, but someone far worse. Senator Michael Harrison, a man who'd championed environmental protection in public while serving darker purposes in private. His transformation was complete, his body a shifting mass of possibilities. "You're too late," he called out, his voice echoing from everywhere and nowhere. The convergence isn't destruction, it's ascension. We'll become gods of both worlds. You'll become nothing, Elizabeth Crowfeather replied. She stood at the ritual circle we'd prepared, every elder lending their power to her words. The barriers exist for a reason. Without them, both realities collapse into chaos. No gods, no humans, no anything. Harrison laughed. Lies to keep us limited. Lies to keep us afraid. Watch as we transcend. The final excavation broke through. The machines screamed as they punched into a chamber that had been sealed since the dawn of human consciousness. The first seal was revealed. Not a physical object, but a concept given form. A crystallized agreement between realities that they would remain separate. It was beautiful. It was terrible. It was already cracking. The shadow entities went mad. Whatever intelligence guided them was overwhelmed by proximity to the seal. They turned on everything. Collective, guardians, us. The battlefield became a 3-dimensional maze of violence where up and down lost meaning. Joseph and I fought our way toward the seal chamber. Our protection bundles burned against our chests. The sacred tobacco Elizabeth had prepared our only anchor to sanity. Around us, reality warped. I saw glimpses of the other phase, a world of living darkness where thought took form and physics obeyed different laws. There, Joseph pointed to where Harrison stood before the seal, hands raised in supplication. Dark energy flowed from him into the cracks, widening them. We have to stop him. We weren't the only ones with that idea. The eldest guardian, the one that looked like a mountain given form, charged through the chaos. It reached Harrison just as the senator began the final incantation. The collision shook both worlds. Guardian and transformed human grappled at the edge of existence, their battle sending ripples through reality. I saw Harrison's face clearly for one moment. No longer human, no longer sane, but still somehow pitiable. He truly believed he was saving humanity. The Guardian's claws found purchase, tearing through Harrison's shifted form. The senator screamed in harmonics that shattered stone. His death was violent, prolonged, and necessary. As he fell, the dark energy pouring into the seal ceased. But the damage was done. The cracks remained, growing slowly but inevitably. "It's not stopping," Reeves said, appearing beside us covered in blood, both human and otherwise. "The process is self-sustaining now. We've got maybe an hour before full convergence." Elizabeth's voice rose above the chaos, calling in languages old and new. The Elder's ceremony reached its crescendo. Throughout the battlefield I saw our people responding, rangers and warriors, scientists and mystics, all adding their will to hers. "The seal can't be repaired," she called out, "but it can be replaced. The old agreement is ending, but a new one can be made. Humanity must choose." Understanding dawned. The first seal had been created by the Nunumbi when they separated the worlds. Now humanity had to participate in creating its replacement, not as subjects of the barrier, but as partners in maintaining it. "Everyone form circles," I commanded through the radio. "Just like we trained. Protection circles, but reversed. We're not keeping something out, we're holding something together." Across the battlefield, circles formed. Rangers who'd learned the ceremonies over the past months, Division 7 operatives guided by tribal warriors, even some collective soldiers who'd rejected their leader's madness in the face of real extinction. We created a human constellation around the tower, each circle a point of stability in the chaos. The Guardians understood. They took positions between our circles, adding their ancient strength to our will. Together, human and Nuambi, we began to forge a new agreement. It wasn't easy. The shadow entities fought us, recognizing that a new seal would trap them again. The reality storms grew worse, people screaming as they experienced both phases simultaneously. I saw rangers age decades in seconds, then return to youth. I saw others fade to transparency before solidifying again. Joseph stood across from me in our circle, chanting in Arapaho, while I recited the protection ceremonies Elizabeth had taught us. Between us, reality flickered. I could see both worlds clearly now, ours with its comfortable physics and linear time, theirs with its fluid possibilities and living darkness. Both were beautiful, both were terrible, both were necessary. "Now," Elizabeth commanded, "choose, not one world or the other, but the balance between them. Choose the boundary, choose the agreement, choose to remember." As one, thousands of voices rose in affirmation, not words but intent, not language but meaning. We chose, we agreed, we remembered. The effect was immediate. Light erupted from every circle, not blinding but clarifying. The cracks in the first seal began to shift, transforming from breaks into patterns. The seal wasn't being repaired. It was being rewritten with humanity as co-authors. The shadow entities shrieked as they were pulled back into their phase. The partially transformed humans faced a choice: complete the change and be banished, or release the shadow and remain human. Most chose humanity, collapsing as the alien energies left them. A few, too far gone, dissolved into the space between worlds. The Guardians roared in unison, triumph, loss, and acknowledgement combined. They began to fade, not dying but returning to their role as watchers between worlds. The eldest paused before me, its ancient eyes meeting mine. It nodded once. Approval, gratitude, warning all in that simple gesture. Then it was gone. The new seal crystallized, incorporating elements of both realities. Where the first seal had been absolute separation, this one was a membrane, firm enough to prevent chaos, permeable enough to allow controlled interaction. The agreement included terms for both sides. Humans would remember and respect the boundaries, while the new Numbi would guard against their own hungry dead. As the light faded and reality stabilized, we found ourselves standing in a changed world. The tower still stood, but now everyone could see the faint lines of power that ran through it. The spirit roads were visible to all, a permanent reminder of what lay beneath the surface of things. "Casualties?" I asked Reeves, dreading the answer. 37 confirmed dead. Over 100 injured. But, she paused, checking her equipment. 0 civilian casualties outside the combat zone. The convergence was contained. Joseph helped his grandmother sit on a boulder. Elizabeth looked exhausted but satisfied. "It's done. The new treaty is sealed in blood and intent." The Guardians witnessed. The old ways merge with the new. I looked around at the aftermath. Division 7 medics treated the wounded while their containment teams secured residual anomalies. Rangers from 12 different parks worked alongside tribal warriors, their uniforms torn and bloodied but their spirits unbroken. We'd lost good people. I'd personally seen Richard Blackwood torn apart by shadow tendrils, and young Amy Chen had simply vanished when a pocket of unreality collapsed. "Williams," a weak voice called. I turned to find Dr. Marcus Webb, or what remained of him. The former archaeologist lay propped against a stone, his hybrid nature failing. Where shadow met flesh, his body was dissolving. I knelt beside him, keeping my hand on my iron spike. "Webb." "I was wrong," he whispered, dark blood seeping from his eyes. "We thought we could control it. Thought the first hunger would grant us power, but it only knows consumption. It showed me the end of everything. Stars going dark, reality itself devoured." He gripped my arm with surprising strength. "There are others. Beijing, London, Cairo. The shattered veil has cells everywhere. They'll try again." "Where's their leadership?" I pressed. "Who's funding this?" Webb's laugh was bitter. "You don't understand. It's not about money or power anymore. The first hunger, it gets in your head, makes you want the emptiness, makes you crave the cold between stars. Once you hear its true voice," he shuddered, "kill me, please, before I lose what's left of my humanity." I looked to Reeves, who nodded grimly. The mercy was swift, delivered by blessed blade. Webb's last expression was one of relief as the shadow parts of him finally separated from the human, both dissolving into the morning air. Over the next hours we catalogued the cost. The binding had held, but at a price. 2 of the 5 guardians had fallen back so far into the spirit realm they might never return. Dozens of rangers and tribal warriors bore wounds that would never fully heal, marks left by shadow claws that cut deeper than flesh. And somewhere in the aftermath we realized that not all the cultists had been accounted for. 17 missing, Reeves reported, her tablet showing incomplete tallies, including their regional coordinator, a woman named Sarah Whitmore, former psychology professor, specialized in consciousness studies. She was one of the first to achieve successful hybridization. Thomas White Eagle joined our impromptu command meeting, his left arm in a sling. My teams found evidence of a prepared evacuation route. They knew the binding might succeed. This was as much about testing our defenses as achieving their goal. Elizabeth stirred from her rest. "They learned much, as did we. The next attempt will be different, subtler, perhaps, or overwhelming in its force." She looked at each of us in turn. "The Confederation must grow, every nation with sacred sites, every people with guardian traditions. The barriers are global. Our response must be the same." I thought of Webb's dying words. Beijing, London, Cairo. How many other convergence points existed? How many other orders of the Shattered Veil operated in shadow? "I'll reach out to my contacts in Europe," Reeves said. "There are others like Division 7, officially non-existent groups that handle the impossible. If we pool resources." "The park services have international partnerships," I added. "Exchange programs. We could embed the training, spread it naturally." Joseph was studying his grandmother's treaty copy. "There's something here about ambassadors, humans chosen to walk between worlds, to speak for both sides. The original treaty had 7, all long dead. Then we choose new ones," Elizabeth said firmly. "Those who've proven themselves, who can bridge old knowledge and new understanding." Her eyes found mine. "You've been marked by the Guardians, William Tarleton. They know your scent, your spirit. You could speak for them." The weight of that suggestion settled on me like a mountain. "I'm just a ranger." "No," Thomas corrected. "Not anymore. None of us are what we were before tonight. The world changed, even if most will never know it." Reeves stood, all business despite her injuries. "Division 7 will need liaisons in every region, official positions, with resources and authority. No more working in shadow. And the tribes will open the old teaching lodges," Elizabeth added. "No more hoarding knowledge. If humanity is to survive what's coming, all must learn." As the sun climbed higher, helicopters arrived to evacuate the wounded. The cover story was already being crafted, a massive wildfire fought by joint agencies, with tragic losses but ultimate success. The media would run with it, adding heroic narratives that weren't entirely false. We had been heroes, just not the kind they'd understand. I found myself standing at the caldera's edge, looking down at the stabilized convergence point. The shimmer remained, but calmer now, like still water after a storm. Through it I caught glimpses of the other side. Forests that were almost like ours, but older, deeper, touched by different stars. Movement caught my eye. The Hartley Guardian stood on the far side of the barrier, watching me. Slowly, deliberately, it placed one massive hand against the shimmer. I understood the invitation and matched the gesture on my side. The contact was electric, overwhelming. For a moment I saw through its eyes, the spirit roads spreading like a vast web across continents, the shadow places where hungry things stirred, the thin spots where reality wore through, but also the beauty of it, the hidden groves where magic still lived, the secret paths between worlds, the dance of energies that kept everything in balance. "Guard well, small walker," a voice like wind through ancient trees spoke in my mind. "The compact is renewed, but the vigil is eternal. We tire. Your kind must learn to stand watch." The connection broke, leaving me gasping. Joseph steadied me, concern in his eyes. "What did you see?" "Everything," I whispered, "and everyone we need to save it." The evacuation continued around us, but I barely noticed. In my mind I was already planning training programs, international protocols, ways to identify those with the sight, to teach them without driving them mad. The shattered veil thought they were bringing about evolution, transformation. They were wrong. The real transformation was simpler, humanity remembering its place as part of something larger. Not conquerors or victims, but partners in an ancient dance. The Guardians had held the line for millennia. Now it was our turn to share the load. "So," Reeve said, joining us at the rim. "Ready to save the world?" I thought of all the normal people below, living their lives unaware of how close they'd come to something beyond nightmare. I thought of the Hartley boys, probably in college now, carrying scars but alive. I thought of every hiker I'd ever guided to safety, every forest I'd sworn to protect. "Every day," I said, "one trail at a time." The binding of the twin roads was complete. The immediate crisis had passed. But as I looked out over the mountains, I knew this was just the beginning. Somewhere out there, Sarah Whitmore and her surviving cultists plotted their next move. The first hunger waited in its cold prison, patient as entropy. And in places we hadn't even discovered yet, new breaches formed, new hungers stirred. But we were ready. Rangers and warriors, scientists and shamans, all united by the knowledge that the boundaries between worlds were worth defending. The Guardians had shown us the way. Now we would walk it together. I adjusted my pack, checked my equipment, mundane and mystical alike, and headed down the mountain. There was work to do. 1 year later. The Yellowstone Ranger Station had a new addition, a discreet back room where the real briefings happened. Maps covered one wall, but these showed spirit roads and convergence points alongside hiking trails. A cabinet held standard first aid supplies next to blessed salt and iron pendants. I stood before a group of new recruits, some Rangers, some Division 7, a few tribal officers, and 3 civilians who'd shown the sight. They looked nervous, skeptical, eager in turns. I remembered feeling the same way. "Welcome to the real orientation," I began. "Everything you thought you knew about these forests is true. It's also incomplete. Let me tell you about the Guardians, the Shadow Hungers, and why we carry iron along with our bear spray." Outside the window, a shadow moved between the trees, too large, too fluid to be natural. I felt no alarm. Some shadows protected us, fiercely as they once terrified. The Guardian paused, perhaps acknowledging the lesson being taught, then melted back into the forest. The watch continued, the treaties held, and somewhere in the space between worlds, ancient eyes approved. The old agreements had become new ones, written in shared purpose and sealed in hope. It was enough, for now. GPS units spin endlessly in certain clearings. Digital cameras capture things that weren't there when the photo was taken. Cell phones receive calls from numbers that don't exist, playing recordings of conversations from missing persons cases dating back decades. I learned this the hard way during my 3rd week as a ranger in the Cascade Wilderness Preserve. The name's Dale Morrison, and I've been patrolling these 47,000 acres for 6 months now, long enough to know that the forest keeps secrets that don't fit in incident reports. It started with the Hendricks family. Michael Hendricks, his wife Sarah, and their twin boys Christopher and Daniel, age 12. They'd registered for a 3-day backcountry permit, planning to hike the Devil's Backbone Trail system. Standard procedure for experienced hikers, nothing unusual in their paperwork. They were supposed to check in at Ranger Station 7 by 4 p.m. on day 2. When 6 p.m. rolled around with no contact, I initiated standard search protocols. The weather had been clear, no reports of wildlife encounters, and the Hendricks had solid outdoor experience. Michael was a former Marine, Sarah a wilderness guide before the kids were born. I found their campsite at dusk, exactly where they'd indicated on their permit. Tent still standing, sleeping bags neatly rolled, camp stove clean and packed. Their vehicle sat untouched in the trailhead parking area, keys still in the ignition. What bothered me wasn't what was missing, it was what was there. 4 dinner plates sat on their camp table, still containing food, fresh food, steam still rising from cups of coffee that should have been cold for hours. The fire pit held glowing coals that crackled and popped as if they'd just been fed new wood. But no people. No signs of struggle, no footprints leading away from camp except their own, circling back on themselves in patterns that made no sense. I radioed for backup and spent the next hour documenting the scene. That's when I noticed the photographs scattered around their campsite. Polaroids that definitely weren't there when I'd first arrived. Each image showed the Hendricks family at various points along the trail. But something was wrong with the pictures. In every photo there was a 5th figure standing just behind them. Tall, covered in dark fur, with eyes that reflected the camera flash like twin flames. The figure appeared progressively closer to the family in each successive photograph. By morning, when the full search team arrived, those photographs had vanished. My incident report mentioned possible wildlife encounter and investigation ongoing. I didn't mention what I'd really seen, or the way my radio had crackled with static that sounded almost like voices calling for help. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, I've learned that the Hendricks weren't the first to disappear in this particular section of the preserve. Park records, if you know how to read between the lines, show a pattern dating back to the area's establishment in 1967. Families, couples, solo hikers, all experienced outdoors people, all vanished without explanation from the same general area. The locals have a name for this stretch of wilderness, the Whispering Valley. The official park maps don't use that designation, but the old-timers who grew up here know exactly what you mean when you mention it. They also know to warn their children away from certain trails after sunset. I've been partnering with Kevin Blackwolf, a member of the Cascade Mountain tribe whose ancestors lived in these forests for countless generations. Kevin works part-time as a cultural liaison for the Park Service, but his real value is his knowledge of things that don't appear in any guidebook or training manual. When I showed him the location where the Hendricks disappeared, his reaction told me everything I needed to know. "This place has always been active," he'd said, choosing his words carefully. "My grandmother called it the threshold. She said it was where our world touches another world, and sometimes people walk through without meaning to." He'd knelt beside one of the strange circular depressions I'd found near the campsite. Bare earth surrounded by healthy forest growth, as if something large and heavy had been resting there for years. "These are old marks," Kevin continued, "much older than the park. My people have stories about what made them, but stories aren't always believed by those who weren't raised with them." That conversation led me to spend my off hours researching everything I could find about the area's history. The official records were sparse, but local newspaper archives told a different story. Dating back to the 1920s, there were scattered reports of logger camps being abandoned overnight, mining operations shut down due to equipment malfunctions, and surveying teams that returned from this valley with accounts of massive bipedal creatures watching them from the tree line. The Native American oral histories went back much further. Kevin introduced me to his grandfather, Joseph Blackwolf, a tribal elder who spoke carefully about the old ones who had walked these mountains since time began. "You're missing families," the old man had said during our first meeting. "They're not the first. The old ones don't take people out of malice. They're trying to protect something. But when humans venture too close to the sacred places, sometimes the boundary between worlds becomes permeable." He'd drawn a rough map in the dirt beside his cabin, marking locations that corresponded eerily with missing person reports. At the center of the pattern was a place he called the Heart of the Mountain, a hidden valley that supposedly contained something his people had guarded for over 1,000 years. "The rangers before you, some of them learned to work with the old ones instead of fighting them," Joseph had continued. "But it requires understanding what you're truly protecting out there. It's not just wilderness, it's something much older and more important than most people could comprehend." Now, as I prepare for another night patrol through the Whispering Valley, I carry more than standard ranger equipment: salt in my left pocket, iron nails in my right, gifts from Kevin that he insists offer some protection, a hand-drawn map from Joseph showing safe paths through areas where reality seems negotiable, and most importantly, an open mind about what might be responsible for the disappearances. The radio crackles with the evening briefing from base station. Weather clear, no wildlife alerts, 3 new camping parties registered for backcountry permits. Routine night ahead, according to official reports. But as I lock my truck and begin the hike toward Sector 7, where the Hendricks vanished, I can already smell wood smoke on the wind. Fresh smoke, carrying the scent of a campfire that shouldn't exist in an area that's been closed to camping since the disappearances began. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, footsteps echo through the trees. Footsteps too large and heavy to belong to any human hiker, following a rhythm that sounds almost like a heartbeat. The forest is waking up, and tonight I'm going to find out what it's been protecting. Every park has its rules, spoken and unspoken. Visitors get the printed guidelines, but rangers learn the real ones through experience. Never follow lights that move between trees after sunset. Don't investigate campsites that appear overnight. If someone asks for directions to Trail 47, tell them it doesn't exist, because officially it doesn't. The smoke led me deeper into Sector 7 than I'd planned to venture alone. Standard procedure demanded I radio for backup before investigating, but my instincts told me this situation required a more delicate approach. After 3 weeks of research and conversations with the Black Wolf family, I was beginning to understand that conventional ranger tactics might not apply here. The source of the smoke sat in a clearing I'd never seen before, despite having memorized every trail map for this section. A campfire burned in a ring of ancient stones, surrounded by equipment that looked decades out of date. Canvas tents instead of modern nylon, cast iron cookware instead of lightweight aluminum, and sleeping bags that appeared to be made from animal hides rather than synthetic materials. But the most unsettling detail was the absence of campers. The fire was fresh. I could hear the green wood hissing and popping, yet no human presence remained. Just like the Hendricks campsite, this felt like a scene interrupted mid-moment, as if the occupants had simply vanished between one heartbeat and the next. I approached with my hand resting on the radio, though Kevin had warned me that electronic communication often failed in this area. The Geiger counter clipped to my belt began clicking rapidly as I drew closer, registering radiation levels that made no scientific sense in the middle of pristine wilderness. That's when I heard the breathing. Deep, rhythmic inhalations coming from the tree line behind me. Each breath lasted longer than any human lung capacity should allow, and the exhalation carried a sound almost like words, not English but something that felt familiar in a way that made my spine prickle with recognition. I turned slowly, following the protocols Kevin had taught me. No sudden movements, no direct eye contact. Show respect, not fear. What I saw standing between two massive Douglas firs challenged every assumption I'd held about what was possible in the natural world. The creature stood over 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its face combined human and ape-like features in ways that suggested intelligence far beyond any known primate. But the eyes, those were what convinced me I was looking at something that deserved respect rather than fear. Ancient eyes, holding depths of knowledge that made me feel like a child stumbling into an adult conversation. We regarded each other in silence for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. The breathing continued, and gradually I began to recognize patterns within it, almost like a language based on breath and rhythm rather than words. When the creature finally moved, it was with deliberate slowness, gesturing toward something behind me. I turned to find 3 more figures emerging from the campsite. The missing Hendricks family, looking exactly as they had in their registration photos except for their clothing. Instead of their modern hiking gear, they now wore garments that appeared to be crafted from natural materials, leather, fur, and woven plant fibers decorated with symbols I didn't recognize. Michael stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried an odd echo, as if it was coming from somewhere deeper than his throat. "Ranger Morrison," he said, though I hadn't identified myself. "We've been waiting for you to find us. Your families are worried sick," I managed. "We've had search teams out for 3 weeks." Sarah moved to stand beside her husband, and I noticed that both twins remained close to the tree line, their eyes reflecting light in a way that human eyes shouldn't. "Time moves differently here," she explained. "What feels like weeks to you has been longer for us. But we're not lost. We're learning." Christopher, or perhaps Daniel, I couldn't tell the twins apart in this light, pointed toward the massive figure still watching from the forest edge. "He's been teaching us about the old agreements, the promises made between his people and ours, back when both sides understood what was at stake." "What agreements?" I asked, though part of me suspected I already knew from my conversations with Joseph Blackwolf. The creature stepped forward, and when it spoke, the sound bypassed my ears entirely, arriving directly in my mind as concepts rather than words. Images flooded my consciousness, vast forests stretching unbroken from coast to coast, indigenous peoples living in harmony with beings most modern humans would consider mythological, and hidden places where the boundary between dimensions remained thin enough for travel between worlds. I saw the establishment of the park system not as an act of conservation, but as a desperate attempt to preserve these crossing points after centuries of encroachment had driven the old ones deeper into hiding. Some early rangers had been brought into the secret, becoming guardians of something far more precious than wilderness recreation. The creature's name, as much as it could be translated into human understanding, was roughly equivalent to Stonewalker or Earth Guardian. He and his kind weren't native to this dimension, but had been living here so long they'd become integral to the ecosystem's spiritual balance. They served as caretakers for places where reality remained flexible, ensuring that certain ancient sites maintained their connection to what Joseph had called the heart of the mountain. But something had gone wrong in recent years. The barriers between worlds were weakening, causing people like the Hendricks to slip through unintentionally. Stonewalker and his people were trying to send them back, but the process required human cooperation, specifically from rangers who could bridge both worlds with understanding rather than fear. The previous ranger in this sector, Michael Hendricks continued, his voice still carrying that strange echo, disappeared because he tried to fight what he didn't understand. We're here by choice, learning what we need to know to return safely, but others haven't been so fortunate. Sarah gestured toward the ancient campfire, which I now realized was burning with flames that cast no shadows. This place is a teaching ground. Stonewalker's people have been trying to train human guardians for decades, but most rangers either flee in terror or treat them as dangerous animals to be contained. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Every missing person report, every unexplained disappearance in the Whispering Valley. They weren't random abductions or fatal encounters. They were recruitment attempts gone wrong, efforts by the old ones to find humans capable of understanding their true purpose in these forests. Stonewalker moved closer, and this time the mental communication came with a sense of urgency. Images of other locations throughout the park system, places where the dimensional barriers were failing entirely. Hikers who vanished permanently because no one understood how to bring them back. Park rangers who went insane trying to document phenomena that challenged everything they'd been trained to believe. And something worse, corporate interests that had begun to notice the unusual electromagnetic readings and geological anomalies in certain wilderness areas. Mining and logging companies that would destroy these sacred sites without ever understanding what they were obliterating. "What do you need from me?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer would change my life forever. The twins stepped forward together, and when they spoke, their voices harmonized in ways that made the air itself seem to vibrate. "Help us establish a proper agreement between the Park Service and the old ones. Become the intermediary that this place has needed for decades. Learn to guide others safely through the crossing points, and ensure that the heart of the mountain remains protected." Stonewalker extended one massive hand toward me, palm upward. In the center of his palm sat a stone that seemed to contain its own internal light, not glowing but somehow more real than the surrounding reality. A focus stone, the mental communication informed me, that would allow me to navigate safely between dimensions while remaining anchored to my own world. Taking it would mean accepting responsibility for something far beyond normal ranger duties. It would mean becoming a guardian of secrets that most humans weren't ready to understand. But it would also mean ensuring that families like the Hendricks could return safely to their own lives, carrying enough understanding to protect others from accidental crossings. The radio on my belt crackled with static, and through the interference I heard my supervisor's voice calling for a status report. The normal world was summoning me back, demanding explanations that would fit neatly into incident reports and budget justifications. I looked around the clearing one more time, at the impossible campfire, at the family who existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, at the ancient being who offered partnership instead of conflict. Then I reached out and closed my fingers around the focus stone. The world shifted around me like a kaleidoscope rotating into a new pattern. I could still see the forest, but now I could also see the layers beneath it. The spiritual landscape that existed parallel to physical reality, the network of crossing points that connected this valley to places that had no names in any human language. When the disorientation faded, I found myself standing alone beside the smoldering remains of a campfire that looked like it had been extinguished for hours. The Hendricks family was gone, but I could sense their presence nearby, existing in a state of transition between their old lives and something entirely new. Stonewalker's final communication echoed in my mind. "Tomorrow night, bring the one who carries the old knowledge. There are others lost in the crossing points, and time grows short for their safe return." I knew he meant Kevin Blackwolf. This was bigger than one family's disappearance. It was about preventing a crisis that could tear reality apart at these ancient crossing points. The radio crackled again, more insistent this time. I lifted it with hands that were still shaking from the dimensional shift. "Ranger Morrison, report your status," came my supervisor's voice. I looked down at the focus stone, which had somehow become warm in my palm. pulsing with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. All clear in Sector 7, I responded. Continuing patrol. We'll report back in 2 hours. But I wouldn't be patrolling normal wilderness anymore. Tonight had changed everything, and tomorrow I would begin learning what it truly meant to be a guardian of the spaces between worlds. Communication equipment undergoes regular maintenance and testing. Radio frequencies, emergency beacons, satellite uplinks. But Channel 19 is never officially used. It's always filled with static and strange transmissions, voices reporting incidents that happened years ago, using call signs for rangers who died before I was born. Kevin arrived at the trailhead just after sunset, carrying a pack that looked heavier than standard hiking gear. When I mentioned this, he smiled grimly and patted one of the side pockets. "Ceremonial items," he explained. "My grandfather insisted I bring offerings for the old ones. Salt, tobacco, carved bone whistles, and a few things that don't have English names." He paused, studying my face in the fading light. "You look different, Dale. What happened out there last night?" I showed him the focus stone, which had been pulsing steadily against my palm since the encounter with Stonewalker. Kevin's eyes widened, and he immediately began speaking in what I assumed was his native language, a series of melodic sounds that seemed to make the stone pulse brighter. "My grandfather was right," he said finally. "You've been chosen as an intermediary. This stone is older than our recorded history. The tribal councils have legends about rangers who carried them, back in the early days of the park system." As we began hiking toward Sector 7, Kevin shared stories I'd never heard before. The establishment of the Cascade Wilderness Preserve hadn't been a simple matter of federal conservation policy. According to tribal records, it had been a desperate compromise between government officials, native leaders, and entities that most people would consider mythological. In the 1960s, logging and mining pressure was getting intense, Kevin explained as we navigated the darkening trail. The old ones were being forced from hiding places they'd occupied for centuries. Some of them didn't handle the disruption well. There were incidents that never made it into official reports. What kind of incidents? Entire logging camps found empty, with equipment arranged in patterns that hurt to look at. Survey teams that returned speaking languages that didn't exist, with memories of cities built inside mountains. Mining crews who dug too deep and broke through into spaces that connected to other worlds entirely. The focus stone grew warmer as we approached the area where I'd encountered Stonewalker. Kevin noticed my grimace and stopped walking. "It's reacting to proximity," he said. "We're close to one of the major crossing points. From here on, we need to follow traditional protocols." He reached into his pack and withdrew a handful of what looked like dried herbs. "Breathe this smoke, but don't inhale deeply. It will help your mind adapt to what we're about to see." The smoke carried scents I couldn't identify, earthy and sweet, with an underlying sharpness that made my sinuses burn. Almost immediately, my vision began to change. The forest around us gained depth and complexity, as if I was seeing multiple versions of the same landscape overlapping like double-exposed photographs. "The crossing points exist in several dimensions simultaneously," Kevin continued, his voice taking on the same echo quality I'd heard from the Hendricks family. "What appears to be empty forest in our world might be a bustling city in another. The old ones learned to navigate between layers of reality the way we walk between rooms in a house. We found the clearing exactly where I'd left it, but now I could see it properly. The ancient campfire was just one layer of what existed here. In other dimensions, visible through the focus stone's influence, this same space contained structures that defied conventional architecture. Buildings that seemed to be grown rather than constructed, made from living wood and shaped stone that pulsed with its own organic rhythms. Stonewalker emerged from between the trees, but now I could see that he wasn't alone. At least a dozen others moved through the dimensional layers around us, some appearing fully physical while others existed as patterns of light and shadow. The old ones, as Kevin's people called them, represented something far more complex than the simple Bigfoot encounters reported in popular media. Kevin immediately began a formal greeting ritual, speaking in his native language while making gestures that seemed to cause the air itself to shimmer. Stonewalker responded with his own ceremonial movements, and I felt the focus stone pulse in harmony with whatever communication was taking place. The mental images that flowed into my consciousness this time were more complex and urgent. I saw a vast network of crossing points throughout the wilderness areas of North America, all connected to a central location that Stonewalker's people called the heart of the mountain. A place where the boundaries between dimensions were so thin that travel between worlds was as simple as walking through a doorway. But something was threatening this entire network. Corporate interests had detected the unusual electromagnetic signatures generated by the crossing points, and they were preparing to conduct exploratory surveys that would destroy the delicate dimensional balance. Worse, some government agencies were beginning to take interest in the anomalous readings, potentially leading to military involvement that could be catastrophic for both worlds. "How much time do we have?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer wouldn't be encouraging. Kevin translated Stonewalker's response. "Less than 2 weeks before the first survey teams arrive. But that's not the immediate problem. The dimensional barriers are already weakening from decades of mismanagement. People are crossing over unintentionally, at an increasing rate, and most of them aren't as adaptable as the Hendricks family." Stonewalker gestured toward a section of the clearing that looked empty to my normal vision but revealed disturbing activity through the focus stone. I could see figures moving in what appeared to be a state of panic. Lost hikers and campers who had become trapped between dimensions, unable to find their way back to their own reality. "Some have been lost for months," Kevin continued. "Time moves differently in the crossing spaces, so they might experience what feels like years while only days pass in our world. The old ones have been trying to rescue them, but it requires human cooperation to guide people safely back to their own dimensional layer." The implications were staggering. Every missing person report in wilderness areas across the country might represent someone trapped in dimensional limbo. And if the crossing points were becoming unstable, the problem would only get worse. Stonewalker approached me directly and extended his hand toward the focus stone. When our connection intensified, the mental communication became so clear, it felt like direct conversation. "You must see the heart of the mountain. Understand what we guard, why the crossing points exist, and what will happen if they're destroyed. But the journey is dangerous for humans who haven't been properly prepared." "I'll need backup," I said aloud. "Other rangers who can understand what we're dealing with." Kevin shook his head. "Most Park Service personnel would either panic or try to contain the situation through conventional means. Either response would be catastrophic. But there are others. Rangers throughout the system who've encountered anomalous activity and filed reports that got buried in bureaucratic files. People who've been waiting for someone to validate their experiences." Stonewalker's mental images shifted to show me faces and locations across multiple states. Rangers in Yellowstone who'd documented impossible wildlife behavior. Supervisors in the Smokies who'd covered up reports of missing time and spatial distortions. Personnel in Olympic National Park who'd learned to avoid certain areas during specific moon phases. "There is a network of guardians already in place," Stonewalker communicated. "Rangers who stumbled into awareness and chose protection over profit. You will contact them. Coordinate responses. Prepare for what's coming." "What exactly is coming?" I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. The focus stone suddenly blazed with heat, and through it I saw visions that made my blood freeze. Corporate survey teams breaking through dimensional barriers without understanding what they were unleashing. Military units attempting to weaponize crossing point technology. Entire wilderness areas consumed by dimensional storms as the barriers between worlds collapsed entirely. And underneath it all, something vast and patient stirring in the deepest layers of reality. Entities that made Stonewalker's people look small by comparison. Beings that had been sleeping while the crossing points maintained their delicate balance. "The survey teams will wake things that have slumbered for millennia," came Stonewalker's final communication of the night. "Things that view both our worlds as temporary inconveniences to be removed." Kevin began packing his ceremonial items, but his movements were urgent now. "We need to reach the heart of the mountain before the new moon," he said. "According to tribal calendar, that's when the dimensional barriers will be at their thinnest. If we're going to establish proper protection protocols, it has to happen then." "How far is this place?" "About 40 miles through terrain that doesn't appear on any official map, and we'll be traveling through multiple dimensional layers to get there. Some of the journey will take place in our world, but other sections exist only in spaces between realities." Stonewalker and his companions were already beginning to fade back into their dimensional layer, but the old one left me with one final image. A vast cavern deep inside the mountain, where something that looked like a combination of advanced technology and living organism maintained the crossing point network across an entire continent. As we hiked back toward the trailhead, Kevin filled in details that made the situation even more complex. The heart of the mountain wasn't just a single location. It was a nexus point, where dozens of realities intersected, maintained by beings who had been serving as dimensional caretakers for thousands of years. "The old ones aren't the only guardians," Kevin explained. "There are others, some that would be even harder for humans to accept. But they all serve the same purpose, maintaining balance between worlds that were never meant to intersect permanently." The focus stone pulsed against my palm as we reached my truck, and I realized it was trying to show me something. When I concentrated on its warmth, images flowed into my mind. Other rangers across the country, people I'd never met but somehow recognized as allies in what was coming. Tomorrow I would begin making contact with the hidden network of guardians that Stonewalker had revealed. But tonight, as I drove home through darkness that seemed deeper than normal, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were already running out of time. The radio crackled with routine chatter from the night shift dispatcher, but underneath the normal communications I could hear something else. Voices speaking in languages that didn't exist, reporting incidents from locations that weren't on any map. Channel 19 was more active than it had ever been, and every transmission carried the same underlying message. The crossing points were failing, and something ancient was beginning to wake up. Search and rescue operations follow established procedures, grid patterns, communication intervals, safety protocols. But sometimes the missing are found in places we've already searched 3 times. They return with no memory of where they've been, but their clothes smell like smoke from fires that burned out generations ago. The Ranger network Stonewalker had shown me proved to be both larger and more sophisticated than I'd imagined. Within 48 hours of beginning my outreach, I'd made contact with 17 Park Service employees across 12 states, all of whom had encountered dimensional anomalies and learned to work around official channels to manage them. The coordination point was a secure communication system established years earlier by a ranger named Robert Chen, who disappeared from Yosemite in 2018 only to resurface 3 months later with knowledge that transformed how certain wilderness areas were secretly managed. Chen had figured out how to use the Park Service's own emergency frequencies to maintain contact between guardians without triggering administrative attention. The key is understanding that we're not really park rangers anymore, Chen explained during our first encrypted radio conversation. We're dimensional border patrol, working to prevent reality breaches that could affect millions of people. The normal Park Service hierarchy can't handle that kind of responsibility. Through Chen's network, I learned that the Cascade Wilderness Preserve was just one node in a much larger crisis. Crossing points throughout the western United States were destabilizing simultaneously, suggesting that whatever was causing the dimensional barriers to weaken was operating on a massive scale. A ranger named Anthony Walsh from Olympic National Park reported that his sector had experienced 15 unexplained disappearances in the past month, all from areas that showed electromagnetic anomalies similar to what I'd documented in the Whispering Valley. Most of the missing persons had been found days later in impossible locations, with memories of living in different time periods entirely. We've been trying to handle this locally, Walsh explained, but the missing persons are starting to come back changed. Some of them speak languages that linguists can't identify. Others have knowledge of historical events that supposedly never happened, and a few have started exhibiting what can only be described as psychic abilities. Joshua Martinez, working out of Grand Canyon National Park, had an even more disturbing report. Survey teams in his area had broken through into a crossing point the previous week, and the dimensional breach was expanding at an exponential rate. It started as a hole in the ground about 3 feet across, Martinez said. Now it's nearly 50 yards wide and growing. Anything that falls into it doesn't come back. But we're getting electromagnetic readings that suggest it's not really empty. There's something massive moving around down there. The focus stone had been growing heavier and warmer throughout these conversations, and when Kevin arrived for our planned expedition to the heart of the mountain, he took one look at it and immediately began preparing additional protective measures. The network activation is accelerating the dimensional destabilization, he explained while arranging sacred items around my equipment. Every crossing point that becomes active makes all the others more unstable. We're approaching a cascade failure scenario. What happens if they all fail simultaneously? Kevin's grandfather Joseph had driven down from the reservation to see us off, and he answered the question with a kind of directness that made my stomach drop. Reality stops being reliable. The barriers between worlds collapse permanently. Entities that have been contained in other dimensions for millennia suddenly have free access to ours, and most of those entities view human civilization as something that needs to be corrected. The old man pulled a rolled hide from his truck and spread it across the ground between us. The surface was covered with symbols and diagrams that hurt to look at directly. A map of the crossing point network is understood by his people for countless generations. This is why the heart of the mountain exists, Joseph continued, pointing to a central symbol that seemed to shift and change when viewed peripherally. It's not just a crossing point, it's a control center. The beings who built it created a system for managing dimensional boundaries across the entire continent, but that system requires active maintenance, and the original caretakers have been compromised. Compromised how? Kevin exchanged a look with his grandfather before answering. Some of them went insane from prolonged exposure to dimensional energies. Others were killed by corporate and military interests who stumbled across crossing points and treated the Guardians as hostile entities, and a few simply disappeared into other dimensions entirely, leaving their responsibilities unattended. The focus stone suddenly blazed with activity, and through it I received a flood of urgent images from Stonewalker. Survey teams were moving faster than expected, not just corporate interests, but military units equipped with detection equipment specifically designed to locate dimensional anomalies. Someone in the government had figured out what was happening and was treating it as a potential national security threat. "We need to leave now," I said, the words coming out with more authority than I'd intended. "The military is already mobilizing. They'll reach the major crossing points within 72 hours. The expedition to the heart of the mountain would normally require several days of careful travel through terrain that existed partially in multiple dimensions, but the focus stone was showing me shortcuts, paths that would compress the journey into a single night by following routes that cut directly through dimensional layers." Kevin loaded additional supplies into his pack while his grandfather performed what looked like a blessing ritual over our equipment. When the old man finished, our gear had taken on a subtle glow that was only visible through peripheral vision. "This will help you navigate the dimensional layers," Joseph explained. "But remember, the heart of the mountain is older than human civilization. The beings who live there don't think the way we do. Show respect, follow their protocols, and don't assume you understand their motivations." We began the hike just after midnight, using headlamps that cast light in ways that revealed the dimensional overlay Kevin's smoke had first shown me. The forest around us existed in multiple versions simultaneously, sometimes empty wilderness, sometimes populated by structures and beings from realities where human history had taken very different paths. The focus stone guided us along trails that appeared and disappeared depending on which dimensional layer we were accessing at any given moment. Some portions of the journey took place in familiar forest terrain, while others required walking through landscapes that definitely weren't part of our normal world. "The old ones have been preparing paths for us," Kevin observed as we navigated a section where the trees grew in mathematically perfect spirals. "This kind of dimensional manipulation requires enormous amounts of energy. They're investing a lot in getting us to the heart safely." About 3 hours into the hike, we encountered our first refugees from dimensional crossings. A family of 4 appeared alongside the trail, wearing clothes from what looked like the 1950s but speaking in accents I couldn't identify. They seemed relieved to see us but couldn't explain how they'd ended up in this place. "We were camping in Glacier National Park," the father explained. "Went to sleep in our tent. Woke up here. That was how long ago? Time doesn't seem to work right." The focus stone revealed their true situation. They'd been trapped in a dimensional buffer zone for what felt like days to them, but had actually been several weeks. Their campsite had intersected with a minor crossing point during a period of increased instability, pulling them into a space between worlds where they'd been wandering ever since. Kevin began a ritual that seemed to create a pathway back to their home dimension, but the process was complex and exhausting. By the time we'd safely returned the family to their proper reality, dawn was approaching and we'd barely covered half the distance to the heart of the mountain. "There are going to be more," Kevin said as we continued our journey. "As the crossing points destabilize, more people will be caught in dimensional transitions. We can't rescue them all individually." The focus stone pulsed with agreement, and through it came images of dozens of similar groups scattered throughout the dimensional buffer zones surrounding major crossing points. Families, hikers, camping parties, and even some Park Service personnel who'd been caught in reality shifts and were now trapped in spaces between worlds. We reached the final approach to the heart of the mountain just as the first military helicopters appeared on the horizon. Through the focus stone, I could see that they weren't just conducting surveys. They were carrying equipment designed to stabilize dimensional breaches through brute force, technology that would be like trying to perform brain surgery with a sledgehammer. "If they reach the major crossing points before we establish proper protocols," Kevin didn't finish the sentence, but the focus stone filled in the implications with images that made me nauseous. Dimensional storms cascading across the continent, reality becoming unreliable across vast areas, and entities from other dimensions pouring through breaches that couldn't be closed. The heart of the mountain rose ahead of us, but it wasn't the simple cavern entrance I'd expected. Instead, we faced a complex of structures that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Crystalline formations that looked natural from one angle but revealed intricate architectural details when viewed through the focus stone. The entire mountainside pulsed with a rhythm that felt almost biological, as if we were approaching something alive rather than mere geological formations. Stonewalker emerged from the dimensional overlay to greet us, but his demeanor carried an urgency I hadn't seen before. Behind him, dozens of old ones moved through the various dimensional layers, all converging on this single location. The mental communication that flowed through the focus stone was fragmented and chaotic, multiple voices trying to convey critical information simultaneously. The military units have already breached 2 minor crossing points. Kevin translated the clearest messages. Their equipment is causing cascading failures throughout the network. We have hours at most before the damage becomes irreversible. Stonewalker led us through an entrance that appeared solid to normal vision but parted like liquid when approached with the focus stone active. The passage beyond defied conventional physics. We seemed to be walking both downward into the mountain and upward into spaces that couldn't exist within normal 3-dimensional constraints. The walls were covered with symbols that hurt to look at directly, writing systems from civilizations that had discovered dimensional travel long before humans evolved. Some of the markings were fresh, added by recent guardians trying to maintain failing systems. Others were so ancient they seemed to be part of the stone itself. My ancestors called this place the Womb of Worlds, Kevin whispered as we descended. They believed all realities were born here and would eventually return here to die. The passage opened into a vast chamber that couldn't possibly fit inside any mountain. The space extended in directions that made my inner ear revolt, with structures floating at impossible angles and distances that changed depending on where I focused my attention. At the center of it all was something that looked like a fusion of organic growth and advanced technology, a massive crystalline tree whose branches extended into multiple dimensions simultaneously. This was the control mechanism Stonewalker had shown me in visions, but seeing it in person revealed complexities that mental images couldn't convey. Each branch connected to a different crossing point throughout North America, and through those connections flowed energy that maintained the barriers between worlds. But many of the branches were dark, their connections severed by human interference or dimensional decay. Around the base of the crystal tree, beings worked frantically to repair damage and reroute failing connections. Some were old ones like Stonewalker, but others defied easy description. Entities of pure energy, creatures that seemed to be made of folded space, and things that existed only partially in any single dimension. A figure approached us that I recognized from Chen's descriptions, one of the original human guardians who'd been recruited decades earlier. William Harper had been a ranger in Yellowstone before disappearing in 1973. Now he existed in a state somewhere between human and something else, his body adapted to survive prolonged exposure to dimensional energies. "You're just in time," Harper said, his voice carrying harmonics that suggested he was speaking from multiple dimensional layers simultaneously. "The military's interference has accelerated the timeline. We need to implement emergency protocols or lose the entire network." He led us to a section of the crystal tree where several branches flickered with unstable energy. Through the focus stone, I could see the crossing points these branches represented, locations throughout the wilderness system where reality was beginning to fragment. The system was designed with safeguards, Harper explained while manipulating energy flows with movements that looked like a combination of Tai Chi and advanced mathematics. But those safeguards assume gradual failure over centuries, not catastrophic breaches happening simultaneously. We need human consciousness to bridge the gap, people who can exist in both realities and guide the repair process. Kevin was already moving toward one of the failing branches, his inherited knowledge guiding him through procedures his ancestors had practiced for generations. But it was clear we needed more help. The network Chen had established was our only hope of coordinating a response across multiple sites. I activated the emergency frequencies, sending coded messages to every guardian in the network. The responses came back immediately, rangers abandoning their regular duties to converge on crossing points throughout their jurisdictions, but the reports they sent were increasingly dire. Anthony Walsh in Olympic reported dimensional storms manifesting as physical weather systems, with reality fluctuations creating impossible atmospheric conditions. Joshua Martinez at the Grand Canyon described the breach in his sector expanding to consume entire trail systems, with rescue teams refusing to approach the affected areas. But it was a new voice on the network that delivered the worst news. Sarah Chen, Robert's sister and a ranger in Rocky Mountain National Park, reported military units at her location using experimental weapons designed to cauterize dimensional breaches. "They're making it worse," she transmitted, her voice tight with controlled panic. "Every attempt to force the breaches closed is creating new fractures, and something's coming through, something big." The focus stone burned against my palm as it relayed images from Sarah's location. Through the dimensional breach, massive shapes were moving, entities from deep layers of reality that had been dormant for eons. The military's ham-fisted attempts to seal the crossing points had instead created highways for beings that should never have access to our world. Stonewalker appeared beside me, his mental communication more urgent than ever. The awakening has begun. The deep dwellers stir. If they fully emerge, both our worlds will be consumed. What do we do? I asked, though I suspected the answer would require sacrifices none of us were prepared to make. Harper gestured toward the crystal tree's core, where a chamber of pure energy pulsed with life. Someone needs to enter the control matrix directly, become part of the system temporarily, guide the repair process from within. But the human mind isn't designed for that level of dimensional exposure. Kevin looked at me, and I saw the same realization in his eyes that was dawning in my own mind. The focus stone wasn't just a tool for navigation. It was preparing me for this moment, adapting my consciousness for survival within the dimensional matrix. How long would I need to stay inside? I asked. Until the network stabilizes. Could be hours, could be days. Time doesn't have the same meaning within the matrix, and there's no guarantee you'll come back entirely human. Through the emergency frequencies, I could hear the situation deteriorating rapidly. More military units arriving at crossing points, more breaches opening as their equipment destabilized reality. More entities pushing through from dimensions that had been sealed away since before human history began. The choice was no choice at all. Show me what I need to do, I said. My training prepared me for natural disasters and wildlife encounters. But they never mentioned the hikers who file complaints about seeing their own campsite from 30 years ago, exactly as they left it. Or the children who go missing for hours, only to return with stories about playing with other kids who wore old-fashioned clothes and spoke in whispers. The pathway to the crystal tree's core opened before me like a wound in reality itself. As I approached, the focus stone began resonating with frequencies that made my bones ache and my vision blur. Kevin and Harper flanked me, their hands on my shoulders providing anchoring points to consensus reality. Remember, Harper said, his voice already beginning to sound distant, the matrix will try to absorb you completely. You need to maintain enough individual consciousness to guide the repairs while resisting total integration. It's like being a drop of water trying to direct an ocean. Kevin pressed something into my free hand, a small bundle of sacred items from his grandfather. These will help you remember who you are. When the dimensional currents threaten to sweep you away, focus on your human memories. They're the only things that will keep you anchored. Stonewalker and the other old ones had formed a circle around the base of the crystal tree, their combined energies creating a buffer zone that would protect the physical space while I worked within the matrix. Through the focus stone, I could see dozens of other beings throughout the dimensional layers adding their strength to the effort. The emergency frequencies crackled with updates from the Guardian network. Sarah Chen reported that the entity pushing through the Rocky Mountain breach had partially manifested, a creature of living shadow that consumed light and left areas of absolute void in its wake. Military units were falling back, their weapons useless against something that existed partially outside normal physics. We're out of time, I said, and stepped into the matrix. The sensation was like being dissolved and rebuilt simultaneously. Every atom of my body seemed to separate and expand, spreading across multiple dimensions while somehow maintaining cohesion. The focus stone blazed with energy, creating a protective shell around my consciousness as I plunged into the living heart of the dimensional control system. Inside the matrix, I could perceive the entire network simultaneously. Thousands of crossing points spread across the continent, each one a delicate balance of energies that had been maintained for millennia. I could see the history of the system, built by beings whose civilization had transcended physical reality long before humans walked the earth, left as a safeguard against the chaos that would ensue if dimensions bled together uncontrolled. But I could also see the damage. Military interference appeared as violent red wounds in the network's fabric. Corporate excavations showed as areas of creeping decay. And throughout it all, the deep dwellers pushed against weakening barriers, seeking entry into a reality they had been denied for eons. The first repair required me to reroute energy from stable crossing points to reinforce failing ones. But the system fought my efforts, recognizing me as a foreign element that didn't belong in its careful patterns. I had to learn to think like the Matrix, to understand its logic that operated on principles beyond human mathematics. Kevin's voice reached me through the focus stone, barely audible across dimensional static. The military units are preparing to use nuclear devices. They think they can cauterize the breaches with extreme force. The horror of that plan sent shockwaves through my dispersed consciousness. Nuclear explosions at crossing points wouldn't seal them. They would shatter the barriers completely, creating permanent rifts between worlds. I could see the potential futures branching out from that decision, each one ending in catastrophe. Working frantically, I began implementing Harper's emergency protocols. Instead of trying to force the breaches closed, I redirected them, creating controlled channels that would allow pressure to release without catastrophic failure. It was like performing surgery on reality itself, requiring precision that pushed my enhanced consciousness to its limits. Through the matrix, I sensed other presences joining the effort. The missing Hendrix family, still existing between dimensions, added their newly acquired understanding to the repair work. Rangers from the Guardian network who had learned to project their consciousness into dimensional space contributed their knowledge and will. Even some of the entities trying to break through began to understand what would happen if the barriers collapsed completely. Mutual annihilation as incompatible realities collided. But the deep dweller that Sarah had reported was different. It wasn't just trying to enter our world, it was trying to consume it, to add our reality to its ever-expanding collection of devoured dimensions. Through the matrix I could perceive its true nature, a cosmic parasite that fed on the collapse of dimensional barriers, growing stronger with each reality it absorbed. "Dale, you need to see this." Kevin's voice came through with new urgency. "The military command structure. It's been compromised. The orders to use nuclear devices aren't coming from human sources." The implications hit me like a physical blow. The deep dweller wasn't just waiting for the barriers to fail. It was actively manipulating events to ensure their destruction. It had reached into our world through the minor breaches and influenced key decision-makers, pushing them toward choices that would guarantee catastrophic failure. I shifted my focus within the matrix, tracing the contamination back to its source. The deep dweller had established connections through several major crossing points, using them like puppet strings to control human actions. Cutting those connections would require severing parts of the network entirely, amputating infected sections to save the whole. "Do it." Harper's voice reached me through layers of dimensional static. "We'll handle the refugees from those sectors. Save what you can." The process was agonizing. Each severed connection felt like losing a part of myself, as the matrix had begun integrating my consciousness into its structure. I could feel the displaced beings from those cut-off dimensions, thousands of entities suddenly homeless as their crossing points ceased to exist. But it was necessary to prevent total systemic collapse. Stonewalker and his people worked to establish refugee zones within stable dimensions, creating temporary havens for the displaced. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was better than allowing the deep dweller access to our reality. As I worked, memories surfaced that weren't entirely my own. Previous guardians who had entered the matrix, some successfully completing their repairs and returning, others becoming permanent parts of the system. I saw William Harper's transformation decades earlier, how he had chosen partial integration to maintain the network through a previous crisis. I understood now why some guardians never came back entirely human. The temptation to remain within the matrix, to exist as pure consciousness across multiple dimensions, was almost overwhelming. "Nuclear devices armed and targeting," Sarah Chen reported. 60 seconds to detonation. There was only one way to prevent the catastrophe. I had to use the matrix itself as a weapon, turning the dimensional control system against those who would destroy it. It went against every safeguard built into the network, but the alternative was the complete collapse of reality barriers across the continent. I reached through the crossing points directly into the military command centers, using the same connections the deep dweller had established. But instead of controlling minds, I showed them the truth, visions of what would happen if they proceeded with their plan. Realities colliding, cities phasing between dimensions, billions of lives lost as incompatible physics tried to occupy the same space. The countdown stopped at 12 seconds. Through the matrix, I felt the deep dweller's rage at being thwarted. It lashed out through every breach it could access, sending waves of dimensional distortion that threatened to undo all our repair work. But now the network was fighting back, its ancient safeguards finally recognizing the true threat. The old ones added their strength to mine, channeling energy through the crystal tree that had been stored for millennia against exactly this kind of crisis. Human guardians throughout the network synchronized their efforts, creating a unified defense that spanned the continent. Even the military units, finally understanding what they were truly facing, redirected their equipment to support our efforts rather than hinder them. The battle raged across dimensions I couldn't fully perceive, fought with weapons that had no names in human language. Reality itself became fluid, reshaping according to will and wisdom rather than following fixed physical laws. And at the center of it all, I held the network together through sheer determination and the anchor of my human consciousness. The deep dweller made one final push, trying to shatter my identity and take control of the matrix directly, but Kevin's sacred bundle pulsed with warmth in my metaphysical grip, reminding me of who I was. Dale Morrison, park ranger, protector of wilderness and wildlife, now protector of something infinitely larger, but still fundamentally the same role, standing between the innocent and forces that would destroy them. With a sound like reality itself screaming, the deep dweller retreated, pulled back into the dimensional depths by the network's restored defenses. The breaches began to seal, not through force but through careful restoration of natural barriers. The crossing points stabilized, returning to their intended function as regulated gateways rather than gaping wounds. "It's working." Harper's voice reached me through clearing static. "The network is stabilizing. You can begin the extraction process." But leaving the matrix proved harder than entering it. My consciousness had spread throughout the system, touching thousands of crossing points and interacting with millions of dimensional layers. Gathering myself back into a single human form felt like trying to compress an ocean into a teacup. Kevin and the old ones guided me back, their combined efforts creating a pathway for my consciousness to follow. Each step toward individuality was agony, giving up the omniscient perspective of the matrix for the limitations of human perception. But with each step I also regained something precious: my humanity, my connection to the physical world, my place in the reality I had fought to protect. When I finally emerged from the crystal tree's core, I collapsed into Kevin's waiting arms. The focus stone in my hand had changed, no longer just a navigation tool, but a permanent connection to the dimensional network. I could feel the crossing points like a subtle pulse in the back of my mind, would always know when reality needed defending. "How long was I inside?" I asked, my voice hoarse from disuse. "3 days," Kevin replied. "The longest anyone has survived full integration without losing themselves completely." Through the emergency frequencies, I could hear the Guardian network coordinating recovery efforts. The immediate crisis had passed, but there would be long-term consequences. Thousands of people had witnessed impossible events during the dimensional storms. The government and military were aware of realities they had previously dismissed as fantasy. The secret was out, and the world would have to adapt. "What happens now?" I asked Harper, who stood watching the crystal tree with an expression of profound relief. "Now we rebuild," he said. "Establish proper protocols, train new guardians, prepare for the next crisis, because this won't be the last time something tries to break through. The deep dwellers have noticed our reality now, and they'll keep testing our defenses." Stonewalker approached, his mental communication carrying something I hadn't felt from him before: respect between equals rather than teacher to student. "You have proven yourself a true guardian. The network acknowledges your sacrifice. You will carry part of it always, and it will carry part of you." The Hendricks family had been successfully returned to their home dimension during the crisis, but they would retain memories of their time between worlds. Michael had already contacted me through official channels, offering to help establish a civilian auxiliary for the Guardian network, people who understood the truth and could help manage the social implications of dimensional awareness. As we prepared to leave the heart of the mountain, I realized my life as a simple park ranger was over. But my true job, protecting the wilderness and those who ventured into it, had expanded to encompass realities I was only beginning to understand. The focus stone pulsed with steady warmth in my hand, a reminder that I was now part of something ancient and vast. Somewhere in the dimensional matrix, my consciousness had left its mark, becoming part of the system that protected our reality from forces beyond imagination. "Ready to go home?" Kevin asked. I looked back at the impossible geometries of the heart one last time, then nodded. "Ready, but home's going to look different now." As we began the journey back through dimensional layers toward the mundane world of incident reports and budget meetings, I could feel the network humming in the background of reality. Thousands of crossing points maintaining their delicate balance, hundreds of guardians standing watch, and somewhere in the depths between worlds, ancient forces waiting for their next opportunity. But we would be ready. The forest had taught me patience, the old ones had taught me wisdom, and the matrix had taught me the true scope of what we protected. Park rangers had always been guardians of the wilderness. Now we were guardians of reality itself. The radio crackled as we emerged into normal forest, Sarah Chen's voice carrying a mix of exhaustion and determination. "All sectors reporting stable. The network holds. Welcome back, Guardian Morrison." I keyed the radio with my free hand, the focus stone pulsing with each word. "Copy that. Sector 7 secure. Standing by for next assignment." Because there would always be a next assignment, as long as crossing points existed, as long as dimensions pressed against each other seeking entry, as long as the deep dwellers remembered our reality's location, we would stand watch. The forest around us looked the same as always to casual observation, but through the focus stone I could see the truth. Every tree, every stone, every seemingly empty space potentially concealed a doorway to other worlds, and each one needed protection. "My name is Dale Morrison. I used to be just a park ranger. Now I'm something more. And the real work has only just begun. It was 2011 when I first set foot in Congaree National Park, deep in the heart of South Carolina. My name is Asher Mulligan, and I just landed my dream job as a park ranger. Growing up in the flatlands of Nebraska, I'd always been drawn to the dense canopy and winding waterways of places like this. Maybe it was the allure of the wild, or perhaps I just wanted an excuse to wear a wide-brimmed hat without judgment. The day I arrived, the air hung heavy with humidity, clinging to my skin like a second layer. The forest stretched before me, ancient and imposing, a cathedral of cypress and tupelo with their knobby knees protruding from the dark water. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in narrow beams, illuminating patches of mist that drifted like spectral entities between the trees. My supervisor, Mark Daniels, a weathered man with leathery skin and eyes that had seen decades of wilderness, gave me a cursory tour. "The locals call this place the Bottoms," he explained as we walked along a weathered boardwalk. "Been here since long before this was a national park. Some of them won't come in here after dark." He glanced at me, gauging my reaction. "Old superstitions die hard in these parts." I nodded, not entirely sure if he was testing me or offering a genuine warning. Either way, I wasn't about to let him think I spooked easily. On my first day of actual duty, I met Elena, another ranger with a sharp wit and a penchant for bad puns. She had been working at Congaree for 3 years and moved with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of the place. "Welcome to the jungle," she said, handing me a map. "We've got fun and games, but mostly just mosquitoes the size of helicopters." "Great," I laughed. I've always wanted to donate blood without the paperwork. We quickly became friends, sharing stories over campfires during overnight patrols and swapping tales of odd things we'd seen in the woods. Elena had a knack for turning the mundane into the extraordinary, making even a squirrel stealing a sandwich sound like a heist movie. But as the weeks passed, I began to notice things. The way certain areas of the park seemed unnaturally quiet. How the local wildlife avoided specific sections without obvious reason. The strange looks that passed between longtime employees when visitors asked about sounds they'd heard in the night. "You'll get used to it," Elena told me when I mentioned it. "This place, it has its own rhythm. You have to learn to listen differently here." One evening, as we finished a patrol route near Cedar Creek, Elena pointed to claw marks high on a tree trunk, far higher than a black bear should be able to reach. "What do you think made those?" I asked. She shrugged, but her usual playfulness was absent. "The official answer is bear. That's what we tell the tourists." "And the unofficial answer?" "Ask me again after you've been here a year." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. The locals had stories, of course. Every small town bordering wilderness had their myths, their cautionary tales to keep children from wandering too far. I'd heard them in snatches, at the diner in Hopkins where rangers often stopped for breakfast, in hushed conversations at the general store in Gadsden. Tales of something that stalked the swamps, something older than the park itself. I dismissed them as folklore, the kind of stories that evolve naturally around places where nature still holds dominion. Until one humid afternoon in late August, when we received reports of unusual animal tracks near Weston Lake. Visitors claimed they'd seen something large moving through the trees, something that didn't quite match any wildlife they knew. Elena and I were assigned to investigate. She was thrilled at the prospect of an adventure. "Maybe it's Bigfoot finally coming out for a selfie," she joked, loading gear into our pack. "Or just a raccoon on stilts," I replied. "Either way, let's hope it's photogenic." As we prepared to head out, Mark pulled me aside. His expression was serious, eyes flicking to Elena and back to me. "Stick to the marked trails," he said quietly. "If you find something unusual, radio it in. Don't play hero." Something in his tone made my stomach tighten. I nodded, suddenly aware of how the shadows seemed to deepen around us despite the afternoon sun blazing overhead. We set out along the boardwalk loop, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and the distant call of birds. The forest was alive with its usual symphony, the drone of insects, the occasional splash of something breaking the water's surface, the creaking of ancient trees as they swayed in the gentle breeze. Yet there was an undercurrent of unease I couldn't shake. It felt like the trees were whispering secrets we weren't meant to hear. "The tracks were reported near the eastern shore of the lake," Elena said, consulting her GPS. "Should be about 2 miles ahead." The wooden planks of the boardwalk felt less substantial with each step, as if we were venturing into the park on a path that might disappear beneath us. The deeper we went, the more the outside world receded. No cell signal penetrated this canopy. No roads cut through this wilderness. We were alone with whatever waited ahead. You ever heard of the kangaroo creature? I asked, breaking the silence that had fallen between us. Elena glanced over her shoulder. Everybody around here has. Supposed to be some kind of predator that's lived in the swamp for generations. Part wolf, part something else. The old-timers say it was here when the first settlers arrived. You believe in it? She shrugged. I believe there are things in nature we haven't classified yet. Does that make it a creature? I don't know. As we ventured deeper, we noticed the usual sounds of the forest growing faint. The chatter of wildlife had hushed, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. The air grew still, as if the swamp itself were holding its breath. It's too quiet, Elena frowned, stopping to listen. Even the mosquitoes are giving us a break. Maybe they took a vacation, I suggested, trying to lighten the mood. But my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. We left the boardwalk where it curved away from the lake, following a narrow dirt path that rangers used for maintenance. The ground grew soft beneath our boots, sucking at each step with muddy reluctance. Cypress knees jutted from the earth like arthritic fingers, reaching for nothing. We found the tracks near a muddy bank. They were enormous, resembling the paw prints of a wolf but much larger, and with an extra digit. The impressions were fresh, the edges still sharp in the damp soil. Elena knelt down to examine them, her face a mask of professional curiosity masking what I suspected was the same unease coiling in my gut. I've never seen anything like this, she murmured, placing her hand beside one print for scale. The track dwarfed her splayed fingers. Wolf prints have 4 toes. These have 5, plus the pad marks are all wrong. Could be a prank, I offered, scanning the tree line. Somebody with a sense of humor and too much free time? She shook her head, probing the depth of the impression. The depth suggests significant weight. Whatever made these is big, 200 pounds at least, and look at the stride length. She pointed to the next track several feet away. That's not someone wearing fake feet. That's something that moves on 4 legs with a hell of a stride. We followed the trail, which led us off the beaten path and into the deeper parts of the swamp. The canopy thickened overhead, transforming midday into dusk. The cypress trees towered above us, their roots twisting like gnarled fingers clutching at the earth. The water beneath the occasional boardwalk was still, reflecting the gray sky above like black glass. Reminds me of that old saying, Elena said, her voice low as if afraid to disturb the silence. If you stare into the abyss stares back. Let's hope it doesn't charge extra for the show, I replied, but my attempt at humor fell flat, swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere. We came across a clearing where the ground was littered with broken branches and disturbed underbrush. In the center lay the carcass of a deer, torn open and partially devoured. The sight was gruesome, the metallic scent of blood mingling with the earthy smells of the swamp. Flies buzzed around the exposed entrails, the only sound in the unnatural quiet. Elena covered her mouth, whether against the smell or the sight I couldn't tell. This isn't a typical predator kill, she said, circling the carcass. Look at how it's been opened. There's no feeding pattern. Bears and cougars have specific ways they consume prey. This is random. It's like it was attacked for sport. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The woods suddenly seemed darker, the shadows deeper. We should radio this in, I suggested, reaching for the device clipped to my belt. She nodded, pulling out her own walkie-talkie. Static greeted us, the signal weak this far out. I'll try climbing that ridge, she said, pointing to a small rise about 50 yards away. Might get better reception from higher ground. I'll stay here and document the scene, I offered, pulling out my camera, though truthfully, I wanted nothing more than to leave this place behind. Elena headed towards the rise, leaving me alone in the clearing with the mutilated deer and the growing certainty that we were being watched. The silence pressed in again, heavier this time. I knelt beside the carcass, forcing myself to take photographs despite the churning in my stomach. The deer's glassy eyes stared at nothing, a mirror of the still swamp water. Its ribcage had been pried open with tremendous force, bones snapped outward like macabre flower petals. This wasn't predation, it was violation. I scanned the tree line, every shadow seeming to shift and move when viewed from the corner of my eye. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, that primal warning system humans still carry from the days when we were prey more often than predators. Minutes passed with excruciating slowness. Elena should have radioed by now. I checked my watch, then the ridge where she'd disappeared. Nothing moved except the flies gorging themselves on the deer's remains. Elena? I called, my voice sounding thin and vulnerable in the vast silence. No response. I stood, brushing mud from my knees, and was about to head toward the ridge when a rustling caught my attention. a deliberate sound of something large moving through underbrush. I turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows between two massive cypress trees. It was massive, standing on all fours but easily as tall as a grizzly bear. Its body was covered in matted fur, dark and slick with moisture that caught what little light filtered through the canopy. The head resembled that of a hyena but distorted, with jaws that seemed too large for its skull and filled with jagged teeth. The proportions were all wrong, limbs too long, joints that bent at unnatural angles, a tail that was more sinew than fur. My breath caught in my throat. The creature locked eyes with me, and in that moment I felt like prey, not just threatened but hunted, a primal sensation I'd never experienced before. Those eyes held intelligence, calculation, the unmistakable focus of a predator assessing its next move. It moved slowly, muscles rippling beneath its hide as it began to circle. Each step was deliberate, testing the ground as if it were more accustomed to marshland than solid earth. Its movements had a fluid quality that defied its bulk, like watching oil flow rather than muscle and bone. I reached for my flare gun, standard issue for emergencies. My fingers fumbled with the clasp, adrenaline making fine motor control nearly impossible. The creature's nostrils flared, scenting my fear on the air. Holding the flare gun up, I called out, "Stay back." The words were foolish, a human command directed at something that had never known human dominion. But they were all I had. It responded with a low, rumbling sound more felt than heard, a vibration that seemed to travel through the ground and into my bones. Its lips pulled back in what might have been a snarl or a grotesque approximation of a smile, revealing teeth stained with old blood. Without warning, it lunged forward, covering the distance between us with impossible speed. I fired the flare, the bright light searing through the dimness with a banshee wail. The magnesium flare arced through the air, illuminating the creature in stark relief. Every matted hair, every ripple of muscle, every gleam of its yellowed fangs. The creature recoiled, not from fear but from the sudden assault on its senses. It gave me precious seconds to run. I sprinted towards the ridge where Elena had gone, abandoning the camera and supply pack without a second thought. Branches whipped at my face, the ground uneven beneath my feet. Roots and cypress knees threatened to trip me with every stride. Behind me I could hear the crashing of underbrush as the creature gave chase, its movements no longer stealthy but filled with predatory purpose. "Elena!" I shouted, my voice ragged with exertion and fear. "We have to go, now!" I reached the base of the ridge, scrambling upward on all fours, fingers digging into soft earth. Behind me the creature paused at the bottom, watching me climb with those calculating eyes. For one desperate moment, I thought it might give up the chase, that the slope might deter it. Then it began to ascend, its claws finding purchase where my fingers had struggled, moving with the assurance of a born climber. Reaching the top, I found Elena frantically trying to get a signal on her radio, oblivious to the danger below. "What's wrong?" she asked, seeing the panic in my eyes and the flare gun still clutched in my white-knuckled grip. "No time," I gasped, grabbing her arm. "We need to move, now." To her credit, she didn't question me. One look at my face told her everything she needed to know. Together, we bolted down the other side of the ridge, aiming for the main trail where the boardwalk would resume. The sounds of pursuit were relentless, crashing through vegetation without concern for stealth. The creature was closing the distance despite our head start, its four-legged gait easily outpacing our human limitations. "There's a service cabin nearby," Elena shouted, veering eastward away from our original path. "We can take shelter there." I followed, lungs burning and legs threatening to buckle. The cabin came into view, a small wooden structure used for storing equipment and providing emergency shelter for park staff caught in storms. Under normal circumstances, it would seem shabby and utilitarian. Now, it looked like salvation. We barreled through the door, slamming it behind us with a force that shook the entire structure. I threw the deadbolt just as something heavy crashed against the outer wall, rocking the cabin on its foundation. Outside, through the small window, I caught a glimpse of our pursuer, its massive form circling the cabin, testing its defenses with calculated precision. In the filtered light, I could now see details I'd missed before. The creature's fur wasn't merely dark. It was mottled with patches of gray and black that created a disruptive pattern. Perfect camouflage for the dappled light of the swamp, not the product of mutation or fantasy, but of evolution, specialized adaptation to a specific environment. Whatever this thing was, it belonged here. We were the intruders. "Help me barricade this," I said, pushing a heavy metal shelf against the door. Elena joined me, her face pale but determined. Together we dragged a workbench, crates of equipment, anything with weight to reinforce our meager barrier. Outside, the creature prowled, its heavy footsteps echoing around the perimeter of the cabin. It scratched at the walls, testing for weaknesses, the sound of claws against wood sending shivers down my spine. Each scrape was deliberate, methodical, not the mindless pawing of an animal, but the systematic exploration of a thinking predator. "What is that thing?" Elena whispered, pressed against the wall beside the single window. Sweat plastered her dark hair to her forehead, and a smear of mud across her cheek gave her a feral appearance. "I don't know," I admitted, checking the room for anything we could use as a weapon. "But it's smart, and it's hunting us specifically." The cabin was sparse: a table, some shelves with maintenance supplies, a first aid kit mounted on the wall. I rummaged through a locker, finding a flare stash and some basic tools. Elena grabbed a metal rod, likely part of a broken tool. "Better than nothing," she said, gripping it tightly, testing its weight with a few practice swings. "There should be a radio," I said, scanning the walls. "These cabins are all supposed to have emergency comms." Elena pointed to a shattered box near the door. "Looks like it had an accident." The creature began ramming the door, the wood splintering under each impact. The metal shelving held, but it was clearly only a matter of time. With each hit, dust rained down from the ceiling, and the entire structure groaned in protest. "Listen," I said, grabbing 2 flares from the stash. "When it breaks through, aim for the eyes or the nose. Most predators protect their sensory organs. I'll try to distract it, give you a chance to get out the window." She shook her head. "We go together, or not at all. I'm not leaving you as bait." There was no time to argue. The barricade shifted with the next impact, the shelf skidding a few inches across the floor. The doorframe was beginning to splinter, wood cracking like gunshots in the confined space. "Ready when you are," Elena said, raising the metal rod like a baseball bat. With a final crash, the door gave way, the shelf toppling backward. The creature burst into the room, its presence filling the small space, seeming even larger in confinement than it had in the open. Up close, the stench was overpowering, a mix of wet fur, stagnant water, and something else, something chemical like musk or territorial marking. I grabbed a flare from the shelf and struck it, the red flame igniting with a hiss. The creature flinched at the sudden light and sound, giving me a moment to assess our opponent more clearly. It stood over 7 feet tall at the shoulder, its body a rippling mass of muscle under that mottled fur. Its face was a nightmare of evolutionary specialization, the elongated snout filled with teeth, designed for crushing bone, eyes set wide for peripheral vision, ears that could swivel independently to track sound from all directions. This was no mythical monster, but something that had adapted to be the perfect predator in this specific environment. I waved the flare towards the beast, forcing it to hesitate as the harsh light assaulted its night-adapted vision. Elena seized the moment, swinging the metal rod with all her might. She struck its shoulder, but the creature barely flinched, the blow seemingly absorbed by its dense muscle. It turned its attention to her, snarling with a sound that was part growl, part hiss, a sound I'd never heard from any known predator. Its eyes narrowed, pupils contracting to slits against the flare's glare. "Hey!" I shouted, thrusting the flare forward. "Over here!" It whipped back towards me, swiping with a massive paw. I felt a sharp pain as claws raked across my arm, tearing through my uniform and into flesh beneath. The flare dropped from my hand, rolling across the floor, still spitting its crimson light. Elena jabbed again, this time aiming for its side. The metal rod struck with enough force to elicit a grunt from the creature. It roared, an enraged sound that shook the walls and seemed to vibrate through my chest cavity. "We can't keep this up," Elena yelled, retreating as the creature advanced on her. I spotted a small window behind us, barely large enough for a person, but our only option. "Through there," I pointed, already moving toward it. I smashed the glass with a nearby chair, clearing the frame of jagged shards. "You first," I told Elena, lighting another flare and tossing it in the opposite corner to draw the creature's attention. She scrambled through the opening, her slim frame barely fitting through the narrow space. I followed immediately after, feeling the creature's hot breath on my legs as I pulled myself through. Outside, we dashed towards the river we could hear rushing nearby, hoping the water might mask our scent or deter pursuit. The forest was dark now, the sun having set during our ordeal, but adrenaline sharpened my senses. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a potential threat. Reaching the bank, we faced a swift current, the water high from recent rains. "Can you swim?" I asked, already knowing we had no choice. "Do I have a choice?" Elena replied, already wading in. We plunged into the cold water, the shock momentarily overriding the pain in my lacerated arm. The current pulled us downstream as we fought to stay afloat, grasping at overhanging branches to slow our progress. Behind us, on the shore, the creature paced along the bank, its massive form silhouetted against the night sky. It followed our progress, moving parallel to us as the current carried us away, but it didn't enter the water. Whether it couldn't swim or simply chose not to, I didn't know. But I wasn't about to question our good fortune. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, we washed up on a muddy embankment far from where we'd started. Exhausted, we collapsed on the ground, breathing heavily. The cool mud a strange comfort against my feverish skin. "Remind me to thank whoever designed that cabin," Elena said between gasps. Sturdy enough to slow it down. I managed a weak laugh, wincing as the movement pulled at my injured arm. And here I thought the biggest hazard today would be paperwork. In the distance, a haunting howl echoed through the trees, not the creature's roar, but something equally primal. The swamp's familiar night sounds slowly returned around us, as if nature itself was signaling that the immediate danger had passed. We assessed our injuries in the weak light of the moon. My arm was bleeding, 3 parallel gashes from shoulder to elbow, but not severely. The thick material of my uniform had taken the worst of it. Elena had a few scratches and a bruised shoulder from our escape through the window, but was otherwise intact. "We need to report this," she said, attempting to wring out her soaked shirt, her professional demeanor returning now that the immediate danger had passed. "Agreed," I replied, gingerly testing my injured arm. "But who's going to believe us?" She looked at me seriously. "We have evidence. The tracks, the carcass, our injuries. We have to try. That thing is still out there." We oriented ourselves using the stars, a skill I'd learned in training but never expected to need, and began the long trek back to the ranger station. We stuck to open areas where possible, avoiding the dense underbrush where something could hide. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing, but we encountered nothing more threatening than an annoyed raccoon. Near dawn, we stumbled into the parking area where the main station stood. The lights were on, our absence had been noticed, and a search was likely being organized. Upon arrival, we found our supervisor, Mark, organizing gear alongside 2 other rangers. "You're both a sight," he remarked, relief evident beneath his gruff exterior. "What happened out there?" We recounted the events, detailing everything we'd seen and experienced. I showed him my injuries, the uniform sliced cleanly by claws sharper than any bear's. Elena described the creature with ranger precision, estimated height, weight, morphological features that matched no known species. Mark listened, his expression shifting from skepticism to concern. When we finished, he was silent for a long moment, eyes distant. "I've heard rumors," he admitted finally. "Stories from the old-timers about something lurking deep in the park. Hunters who came back raving about a predator that hunted them instead. Trappers who found their snares sprung by something too clever to be caught." He shook his head. "I always dismissed them as tall tales, the kind you tell around campfires." "Well, it's not a rumor," Elena insisted, spreading out our mud-stained map to mark the location of our encounter. "We need to close off that area and warn the others. Whatever that thing is, it's territorial and aggressive." He nodded, the decision already made. "I'll make the calls. In the meantime, get yourselves checked out. Those cuts need proper cleaning," he added, gesturing to my arm. Over the next few days, a search team was assembled to investigate. They found the clearing, the carcass of the deer, and large footprints matching our description. But of the creature itself, there was no sign. The cabin showed evidence of our struggle. The broken door, scattered flares, blood on the floor, both human and unknown. Samples were collected and sent for analysis. The results came back inconclusive. The DNA was similar to canid but with anomalies the lab couldn't explain. Contamination, they suggested. Sample degradation, convenient explanations for inconvenient truths. The park issued a temporary closure of certain trails, citing safety concerns due to wildlife activity. Officially, in reports filed with the Department of Interior, it was labeled as a bear attack, though we knew better. The explanation satisfied the bureaucracy and kept the tourists from panicking, but did nothing to answer the questions that kept me awake at night. What was that creature? How many more were there? And how had they remained undiscovered in a national park visited by thousands each year? In the months that followed, I threw myself into research. I interviewed locals, pored over historical records, sought out the oldest rangers for their stories. A pattern emerged, sightings every decade or so, always in the deepest parts of the swamp, always dismissed or rationalized away. Native American legends spoke of shadow walkers that guarded the swamplands long before European settlement. Early colonists wrote of swamp wolves that walked on 2 legs when they thought no one was watching. One evening, As Elena and I sat outside the station after a routine patrol, I shared my findings. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the swamp coming alive with night sounds. "It's strange, isn't it?" she mused, staring into the tree line. "We spend our lives protecting nature, and yet there's so much we don't understand about it." "Maybe some things are meant to stay hidden," I replied, rubbing absently at the scars on my arm, now healed but still sensitive. "Maybe there are corners of the world that don't belong to us, no matter how many maps we draw or parks we establish." She chuckled, but the sound lacked humor. "That's a comforting thought when you're safe inside, less so when you're out there with them." "Next time, let's hope the hidden things are a bit friendlier," I added, "or at least have better manners." "That one definitely skipped charm school," she agreed, and we shared a laugh that carried the edge of survivors who know how close they came to not surviving at all. We never encountered the creature again, but its memory lingered in every shadowed grove, every stretch of swamp that fell too quiet at our approach. I still worked the trails, still guided tourists through the safe, marked paths of Congaree, but I never ventured into certain areas alone, and I made sure to be out of the park by nightfall. The swamp returned to its usual rhythm, visitors unaware of what lay beyond the boardwalks. They snapped their photos, marveled at the ancient trees, and left with their pleasant memories untainted by knowledge of what truly ruled these waters after dark. As for us, the rangers who knew the truth, we continued our work, a little more cautious but no less dedicated. We were the thin line between two worlds, the civilized one we came from, and the wild one we served. Some days, that line felt thinner than others. After all, someone had to keep an eye on things, both the seen and the unseen. Someone had to know where to look and where not to look. Someone had to remember that not all territories on the map were truly claimed by human hands. And on quiet nights when the fog rolled in, I'd sometimes hear a distant sound. Not quite a howl, not quite a roar, and know that the creature was still there, still watching, still waiting in the shadows of the cypress trees. There's a stillness to these woods that people from the city never quite understand. It's not the absence of sound, it's a presence, something alive and breathing. I've been a ranger at Blackwater National Forest for 15 years, and that stillness still follows me into my dreams. My cabin sits on the edge of the northwestern quadrant, about 30 miles from the nearest town. The Forest Service built it in the 1940s, all sturdy pine logs and simple furnishings. Solar panels and a satellite phone are the only concessions to modernity. Management wanted to install cameras and sensors throughout the park, but I fought against it. Some places should remain untouched by technology's gaze. Tonight, as I write this account by lantern light, the wind pushes against the windows with unusual force. It reminds me of something I read in Stephen King's The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon, about how the wilderness isn't just indifferent to human suffering, sometimes it seems actively hostile. 3 days ago, I received a call about hikers missing on the Coldwater Trail. A family of 4 had ventured out for a day hike and never returned to their campsite. Standard procedure dictates assembling a search party, but a storm was moving in and backup couldn't arrive until morning. Sometimes waiting isn't an option. I grabbed my pack. Emergency supplies, first aid kit, flares, GPS, and my trusty rifle. Not for the wildlife you'd expect. Bears are predictable. Mountain lions keep their distance. It's the other things that concern me. The search and rescue logs in this region contain peculiar details that never make the official reports. Unusual track patterns. Items arranged in geometric formations no animal could create. And the sounds. Low, resonant vocalizations that carry for miles through the valleys. "Did you hear that?" a hiker once asked me during a rescue. "Like something huge walking on 2 legs. I nodded but said nothing. We don't talk about these things officially, but among rangers the stories persist. As I locked my cabin and headed toward Coldwater Trail, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, not by anything human. The forest was unusually quiet that evening. No birds, no insects. Just silence and the sound of my boots on packed earth. What happened over the next 72 hours changed everything I thought I knew about these woods, about what lives here, about what's possible. The thing about working in wilderness rescue is that everyone expects a happy ending. Find the lost hikers, bring them home, file the paperwork. But as I headed deeper into Blackwater that night, following the beam of my flashlight into the gathering darkness, I knew this would be different. I've seen strange things in these woods over the years. Tracks that shouldn't exist, tree structures no human could build, and sometimes, just at the edge of my peripheral vision, something large moving between the trees. The locals have a name for it. The old-timers who lived here before the land became federal property. They called it the Watcher. I never gave it much credence, until now. I picked up the family's trail near Coldwater Creek. Their footprints told a story, casual walking patterns suddenly transforming into a chaotic scramble. Something had spooked them, something big. "Hello?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the dense forest. "Forest Service, if you can hear me, respond." Only silence answered. Then, faintly, I heard it, a low, rumbling vocalization that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Not quite animal, not quite human. The hairs on my neck stood up. In 15 years, I'd never heard anything like it. I quickened my pace, following the family's tracks deeper into the darkness. Whatever had happened to them, whatever had scared them, I was now walking straight toward it. The tracks led me to a small clearing about 4 miles from the trailhead. What I found there defied explanation. The family's belongings, backpacks, water bottles, a child's stuffed animal, arranged in a perfect circle. In the center lay a single boot, adult-sized, caked with mud. No signs of struggle, no blood, just a deliberate arrangement that no animal or panicked human would create. I documented everything with my camera, though I knew these photos would likely never appear in any official report. Some things get classified or simply lost in the bureaucracy. A user on a forum I frequent, Wilderness Watcher 76, once described finding a similar scene in Olympic National Park. The circle of items wasn't random, they wrote. It was like communication, something trying to use human objects to speak. As I examined the clearing, the feeling of being observed intensified. The forest remained unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath. I called out again for the missing family, my voice echoing through the trees. No response. I decided to establish a base camp in the clearing. If the family returned, they would come back for their belongings. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and prepared for a long night. Around 2 a.m., I was awakened by heavy footsteps circling my camp. Not the cautious movements of a bear or deer. These were deliberate, bipedal steps. The fire had burned low, casting just enough light to see the edge of the clearing. I reached slowly for my rifle, keeping my breathing steady. The footsteps stopped. Then came a sound I'll never forget. A series of wood knocks, rhythmic and intentional. 3 quick taps, followed by 2 slow ones. Then silence. After several minutes, I worked up the courage to shine my flashlight toward the sound. The beam caught something moving between 2 massive pines, something large, covered in dark hair, walking upright. It disappeared before I could process what I'd seen. I spent the remainder of the night with my back against a tree, rifle across my lap, replaying the encounter in my mind. Was it a bear? Impossible. The gait was wrong, the height too great. A human in a suit? Out here, miles from anywhere? Absurd. As dawn broke, I found tracks at the edge of the clearing, 18 inches long, humanoid but not human, pressed deep into the soft earth. Whatever left them was heavy, much heavier than a person. I photographed these too, knowing they'd be dismissed as bear tracks or a hoax. The Forest Service has an unwritten policy about such findings. Document, then forget. Some rangers claim evidence disappears from locked file cabinets, reports get rewritten, witnesses transferred to different parks. I've always followed protocol, kept my head down. But finding that family mattered more than institutional silence. With morning light, I discovered a new trail leading away from the clearing. Broken branches and disturbed undergrowth heading northwest, toward the most remote section of the park. The family hadn't left these signs, they were too high up, branches broken 8 feet above the ground. I followed this new trail, moving cautiously, senses heightened. The forest had resumed its normal sounds, birds calling, insects buzzing, as if whatever had silenced them had moved on. After an hour of tracking, I found a child's shoe beside a massive footprint. Then another footprint, then another. The trail was becoming clearer, more deliberate, as if whatever made it no longer cared about being followed. By midday, I reached Black Ridge Overlook, a rocky outcropping offering views across the valley. Below me stretched miles of unbroken forest. In the distance, I spotted an anomaly, a structure of some kind, not marked on any map. Too regular to be natural, too crude to be man-made. As I studied it through my binoculars, a movement caught my eye. Something massive emerged from the tree line below the structure, walking upright on 2 legs. It was at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair, moving with surprising grace for its size. It turned and looked up, directly at me. Even from hundreds of yards away, I felt its gaze lock onto mine. It raised one enormous arm, pointing deliberately at the structure, then back at me. It wasn't threatening me. It was inviting me. The descent from Black Ridge Overlook took longer than expected. The terrain was treacherous, steep slopes covered in loose shale that shifted underfoot. Twice I nearly lost my footing, saved only by grabbing onto saplings growing between the rocks. By the time I reached level ground, the afternoon sun had begun its descent behind the western mountains. I checked my GPS coordinates and marked my position. If search and rescue came looking, they'd need to know where I'd gone. The structure I'd spotted from above was still a mile away, hidden now by the dense forest. I followed game trails when possible, keeping my orientation by checking moss growth on trees and the position of the sun through breaks in the canopy. As I drew closer, I began finding unusual arrangements in the forest. Stick structures forming complex geometries, rocks stacked in impossible balances, reminiscent of something I'd read in a Reddit thread where a backcountry guide described finding similar constructions in remote areas of the Yukon. These weren't random or natural, the guide had written. They showed mathematical precision, understanding of structural integrity. Whatever built them was intelligent. The thread had been deleted within hours of posting. Half a mile from the structure, I found the first clear sign of the missing family. A torn piece of fabric from a blue jacket, caught on a thorn bush, fresh enough to have been left recently. My pace quickened. The forest changed as I approached my destination. The trees grew larger, older, with thick canopies that blocked much of the sunlight. The temperature dropped noticeably. The ground became spongy with centuries of accumulated leaf litter, muffling my footsteps. Then I saw it, the structure. Not a building in any conventional sense, but a complex arrangement of massive logs and branches, woven together and partially covered with vegetation. It resembled a huge nest or den, but with distinct chambers and a central opening that served as an entrance. It stood nearly 15 feet tall and twice as wide, nestled between ancient cedars that seemed to form natural pillars, supporting its weight. No human could have built this without heavy equipment, which was impossible to bring this deep into the wilderness. I approached cautiously, rifle ready but not raised. If the family was inside, I didn't want to appear threatening. If something else was inside, well, I doubted the rifle would make much difference. "Hello," I called out, stopping 30 feet from the entrance. "Forest Service, is anyone there?" Silence. Then, faintly, a child's voice. "Help us." I rushed forward, caution abandoned. The entrance was larger than it had appeared from a distance, easily 8 feet tall, forcing me to stoop only slightly as I entered. Inside, the structure opened into a space larger than my cabin. Filtered light entered through gaps in the woven ceiling. And there, huddled in the far corner on a bed of soft grasses, was the family. Mother, father, and 2 children. A boy around 10 and a girl perhaps 7. They were alive, unharmed, terrified. "Thank God," the father said, his voice hoarse. "Are we rescued?" I approached slowly, taking in the surroundings. The interior was surprisingly dry and clean. Various forest materials, pine needles, moss, grasses, had been arranged to create distinct living areas. In one corner sat the family's backpacks, neatly placed but apparently untouched. "Are you all okay?" I asked, kneeling beside them. "Are you hurt?" The mother shook her head. "We're fine. It brings us food, water. It doesn't want to hurt us." I looked at her sharply. "It? What do you mean?" The father glanced nervously toward the entrance. "We were hiking, got turned around after dark. Then we heard something following us. We ran, but it herded us here, like a sheepdog with sheep. It's kept us here since." "What is it?" I asked, though I already knew their answer. The little girl looked up at me with wide eyes. "The forest man," she whispered. The boy nodded vigorously. "It's huge, covered in hair, walks like a person but isn't a person." I helped them to their feet, doing a quick medical assessment. They were dehydrated despite the water they claimed they'd been given, and hungry though not starving. No injuries beyond minor scratches and bruises. "We need to move," I said, checking my watch. "We have maybe 3 hours of daylight left. If we hurry, we can reach a ranger station before dark." As I helped them gather their belongings, I noticed markings on the interior walls, crude symbols etched into the wood. Not random scratches, but deliberate patterns that repeated in sequences. "It makes those," the mother said, following my gaze. "It sits there for hours, carving with its fingers." I photographed the symbols quickly. Something about them seemed familiar, though I couldn't place why. We exited the structure into the afternoon light. The family stayed close, jumping at every sound from the forest. I kept them moving at a steady pace, following my GPS back toward established trails. We'd covered perhaps half a mile when we heard it behind us, Heavy footsteps, breaking branches, moving fast. "Run," I said quietly, then louder. "Run." We crashed through the underbrush, the family ahead of me as I brought up the rear, constantly checking behind us. The father carried the younger child. I helped the boy navigate the difficult terrain. Whatever pursued us was gaining ground, moving through the forest with the ease of something that had lived there for generations. "Don't look back," I instructed them. "Just keep moving." The sounds behind us grew louder. Not just footsteps now, but vocalizations. Low, rumbling calls that seemed to come from multiple directions. Were there more than one? A post I'd read on a cryptid forum years ago came back to me. They hunt in family groups. They communicate. They coordinate. At the time, I'd dismissed it as fantasy. Now, hearing those calls echoing through the trees, I wasn't so sure. We reached a small stream and I made a quick decision. "Into the water," I ordered. "Walk downstream. It might mask our scent." The water was knee-deep and ice-cold, numbing our feet as we waded along the rocky bottom. The mother stumbled once, nearly dropping her pack, but the father caught her arm. The children were silent, wide-eyed with fear but following instructions perfectly. After several hundred yards in the stream, I directed the family up the opposite bank and into a dense thicket of young pines. The close-growing trees would make it difficult for something large to follow. I hoped. "Rest," I whispered, setting down my pack. 5 minutes, not more. They collapsed onto the ground, breathing heavily. I distributed water and energy bars from my supplies, watching their faces in the fading light. The father met my eyes, a question forming. "What are they?" he asked quietly. I hesitated. The indigenous people of this region had stories about forest giants. Every culture does, really. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, Wendigo. Different names for similar entities. "Those are myths," the mother said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I've worked these woods for 15 years, I replied. "I've seen things that don't match any known species. Tracks, structures, heard sounds no recognized animal makes. The Forest Service has files." I stopped myself. Official policy was clear on discussing such matters with civilians. "We need to keep moving," I said instead. "There's an emergency shelter 4 miles east. We can secure it for the night. Radio for evacuation at dawn." As we prepared to move out, the little girl tugged at my sleeve. "It's not bad," she whispered. "The forest man. It gave me berries. It made a doll from grass." Her mother pulled her close. "Emma, don't." "But it's true," the child insisted. "It showed me pictures on the wall, about people from long ago, about others like it that used to live here." I knelt to her level. "What kind of pictures, Emma?" "People hunting them, hurting them. Then the forest man all alone." Her eyes welled with tears. "It's sad. It's the last one." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with my wet clothes. Before I could question her further, a massive crash sounded from the direction we'd come. Something large was plowing through the undergrowth, heading straight for our position. "Move," I ordered, helping them to their feet. "Stay together." We pushed through the pine thicket, emerging onto a game trail that headed eastward. Perfect. It would allow us to move faster. Too perfect. As we hurried along the path, a terrible suspicion formed in my mind. "Wait," I said suddenly, stopping the group. "This is too convenient." The father looked at me in confusion. "What do you mean?" "This trail. It's leading us exactly where we want to go." I checked my GPS. Too exactly. As the words left my mouth, a shadow moved across the trail ahead of us. Something stepped out from behind a massive cedar. Something tall, broad-shouldered, covered in dark hair. It stood upright on 2 legs, its face a mixture of human and ape-like features, yet somehow neither. Intelligent eyes regarded us from beneath a heavy brow ridge. The family froze in terror. I raised my rifle instinctively, then slowly lowered it. The creature made no aggressive move. Instead, it raised one massive hand, palm outward, in what seemed a universal gesture. "Stop." Then it pointed deliberately back the way we'd come, toward its structure, and made a series of complex vocalizations, not growls, but something closer to speech. "It wants us to go back," Emma whispered. "It's trying to protect us." "From what?" her brother asked. The answer came with a distant sound that made my blood run cold. Human voices, men calling to each other, and the mechanical growl of ATVs moving through the forest. The creature, I cannot think of it as merely an animal anymore, gestured again with increasing urgency. The sounds of engines and men grew louder. I made a split-second decision. "Follow it," I told the family. The father stared at me in disbelief. "You can't be serious." Listen, I said, keeping my voice low. Those aren't Forest Service vehicles. They're not following any established trail. Whoever they are, they're not here officially. As if to confirm my suspicions, we heard a sharp crack, a rifle shot echoing through the trees. The creature turned and moved swiftly into the forest, looking back once to ensure we followed. After a moment's hesitation, the family fell in behind me as I tracked the massive figure through the gathering darkness. It led us on a winding path that avoided open areas, staying within the densest parts of the forest where vehicles couldn't follow. Its knowledge of the terrain was impeccable. Several times it directed us around deadfalls or washouts before we could see them. After nearly an hour of hard travel, we arrived at what appeared to be a sheer rock face covered in vegetation. The creature pulled aside a curtain of vines to reveal a narrow opening, a cave entrance hidden by the natural overgrowth. It motioned for us to enter. I hesitated, then ducked inside, using my flashlight to illuminate the space. The cave extended about 30 feet into the hillside, dry and surprisingly warm. At the back were more of the stick structures we'd seen in the forest, smaller versions arranged like furniture. Crude drawings covered the walls, not just recent markings, but imagery that appeared to have been there for decades, perhaps centuries. The family entered cautiously, the children staying close to their parents. The creature came in last, delicately replacing the vine curtain to conceal the entrance. In the beam of my flashlight, I could see it clearly for the first time. It stood at least 8 feet tall, its body proportioned like a human but more massive, covered in dark brown hair except for its face and palms. The face was the most striking feature, expressive eyes set under a prominent brow, a flat nose, heavy jaw, not human yet undeniably humanoid. It regarded us without apparent fear, then moved to the back of the cave where it retrieved something from one of the stick structures, a leather-bound book, weathered and water-stained. It held the book out to me. With trembling hands, I took it and opened the cover. Inside was a Forest Service field journal, dated 1976. The handwriting was faded but legible. September 14, third sighting this month. The specimen appears to be female, approximately 7 foot in height. Dr. Keller believes they represent a relic population of early hominids, perhaps surviving in isolation since the Pleistocene. Our orders are to document but not interfere. Washington wants complete secrecy until the study is complete. I flipped through more pages, reading entries that documented a years-long study of these creatures, their social structures, communication methods, intelligence. The final entry was dated October 3, 1978. New orders received. Operation Silverback is terminated. All specimens to be removed for study. Team arriving tomorrow with tranquilizers and transport. God forgive us. The next page had been torn out, but blood stained the remaining edge. I looked up at the creature, understanding dawning. They hunted your family, I said softly. You're the last one. It made no sound, but its eyes conveyed what seemed like decades of loneliness and loss. Outside, the mechanical sounds had stopped. Men's voices called back and forth, closer now. Who are they? The mother whispered. I shook my head. I don't know. Government, maybe. Private collectors. There are people who've been trying to prove these creatures exist for decades, others who want to make sure they're never discovered. What do we do? Asked the father. I thought quickly. They're looking for it, not us. At dawn, I'll get you to the ranger station. Report you found, simple rescue. Never mention any of this. And him? The little girl asked, looking at the creature without fear. I don't know, I admitted. The creature moved to the wall of the cave, pointing to a series of drawings. They showed humans and his kind together, not fighting but cooperating, hunting together, building shelters. Then images of separation, conflict, retreat into the deep forest. It's a history, I realized aloud. Your history with humans? It nodded, then pointed to the children, then back to the drawings of cooperation. You want peace, I said. Coexistence. Another nod. Outside, voices approached the hillside. Flashlight beams played across the vines covering our hiding place. The creature moved to a narrow passage at the back of the cave I hadn't noticed before. It gestured for us to follow, then disappeared into the darkness. We crawled through a tight tunnel that opened into another, larger chamber. This one had a small underground stream running through it and, remarkably, an opening to the night sky above, a natural chimney providing ventilation. The creature pointed upward, then at me, then made a gesture like using a phone. Signal, I realized. I could get reception up there. I climbed the rough stone wall to the opening, about 15 feet up. As I reached the top, my satellite phone picked up a weak signal, enough for a text message, not a call. I sent a coded emergency alert to my supervisor, Code Silver at Blackridge, unauthorized personnel in preserve, witnesses. It would bring an official response force by morning. When I descended, the creature had arranged pine boughs into sleeping pallets for the family. It offered them dried berries and what looked like strips of smoked fish from a stone cache in the corner. The night passed tensely, with the sounds of the searchers occasionally audible through the cave system. The children eventually fell asleep, exhausted from the ordeal. The parents and I took turns keeping watch alongside the creature, who seemed to need little rest. During my watch, I studied our unlikely protector as it sat motionless, listening to the forest. I thought about the journal, about what had happened here decades ago, about what would happen when morning came. "They'll come for you again," I said quietly. "If they know you exist, they'll never stop." It turned to me with those ancient, intelligent eyes and placed one massive hand over its heart, then reached out to touch my chest gently. The message was clear: trust, connection, a choice. Dawn broke with the sound of Forest Service helicopters in the distance. The creature led us back through the tunnel system to a different exit, one that emerged in a dense grove of trees half a mile from where we'd entered. "The ranger station is 3 miles that way," I told the family, pointing east. "Stick to my story. You got lost, I found you. Nothing unusual." "What about you?" the father asked. "I'm staying," I replied. "My decision made during the long night. Someone needs to document what's happening here. Someone official." The mother hugged me impulsively. "Be careful." As they prepared to leave, the little girl approached the creature without fear and held out her hand. After a moment's hesitation, it extended one massive finger, which she grasped briefly. "Goodbye, forest man," she said. After the family departed, the creature and I returned to the cave. I used my camera to document everything: the journal, the wall drawings, the structures, evidence of an intelligence that science had refused to acknowledge. I don't know what will happen when my colleagues arrive, whether this revelation will be buried like all the others, or if this time, the truth will finally emerge. What I do know is that these woods hold wonders and secrets beyond what most humans ever imagine. If you're reading this, it means my report made it out. That someone, somewhere, decided the truth was more important than the secrets we've kept for decades. The creature, no, the being, watches me writing this account. It understands more than it can say. It has survived alone for too long. It is the last of its kind. But perhaps not for much longer. 23 years as a park ranger, and I've never told this story, not officially at least. Some things don't belong in incident reports. Some experiences defy the clean lines of our training manuals. But as I approach retirement, I find myself needing to document what happened that autumn in the North Cascades, if only to convince myself it was real. The Skagit Range is unforgiving. 70,000 acres of dense forest, sheer cliff faces, and hidden valleys where the sun barely reaches. Cell reception is a distant memory once you're 5 miles in, and even our radio equipment struggles against the mountain's ancient resistance to modern intrusion. I'd been stationed at Outpost 17 for 8 seasons by then, a simple cabin nestled between towering Douglas firs, built in the 1940s and renovated just enough to keep the roof from leaking. 2 rooms, a wood stove, shelves of equipment and emergency supplies. The windows faced the trail and the small clearing I'd carved out for official vehicles. Beyond that, wilderness stretched in every direction. That particular September had been unusually quiet. The summer hikers had thinned out, and the winter adventurers hadn't yet arrived. Just me, the constant wind through the canopy, and occasional visits from my supervisor Martin during supply runs. I was reading The Indifferent Stars Above by Daniel James Brown, a historical account of the Donner Party, when the first call came in. A family of 4, 20 miles northeast of my position, hadn't returned to their campsite. The father had radioed in that morning, saying they'd spotted unusual tracks and wanted to investigate. They carried a satellite phone but hadn't responded to calls for 6 hours. Standard procedure. I gathered my pack, equipment, first aid kit. The light was already fading, but I knew that territory well enough to navigate in low light. I'd found lost hikers in worse conditions. What I couldn't have known was that this search would lead me to question everything I understood about these forests and about what might inhabit their deepest regions. I logged my departure in the system, locked the cabin, and headed out. The autumn air carried that specific crispness that precedes winter, and leaves crunched beneath my boots as I followed the main trail before branching off toward the family's last known coordinates. 4 hours in, night had fully descended. My headlamp carved a tunnel through darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. The forest was silent, too silent. No owls, No rustling of nocturnal creatures, just the sound of my breathing and footsteps. That's when I first felt it, the sensation of being watched. I've spent most of my adult life in wilderness. I know the feeling of animal eyes tracking movement, curious deer, cautious bears, the rare mountain lion. This was different. This felt deliberate, intelligent. I stopped, switched off my headlamp, and listened. Nothing. Then, from perhaps half a mile away, wood striking wood. 3 distinct knocks, evenly spaced. A pause. 3 more knocks. My radio crackled. Base to Ranger Thompson. Any sign of the Sullivan family? I nearly jumped out of my skin. The knocking stopped immediately. Negative, I responded, trying to keep my voice steady. Continuing northeast. Will report when I reach their last known position. As I switched my lamp back on, something large moved in the periphery of my vision. Just a shadow, gone before I could turn. But the impression it left was of something tall, far taller than any bear moving on hind legs. I told myself it was exhaustion. Tricks of light and shadow. The power of suggestion from those strange knocking sounds. I didn't believe it then. I don't believe it now. Because scratched into a tree trunk at eye level, fresh enough that sap still seeped from the marks, was a crude symbol. A vertical line with 3 horizontal branches, like a simplified human figure, but wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. I took a photo with my digital camera and continued walking. The feeling of being watched never left. Dawn broke through the trees as I reached the Sullivan family's campsite. Their tent remained pitched, sleeping bags still inside. Backpacks leaned against a tree. Food properly stored in a bare canister. No signs of struggle, no panic. They had simply walked away and not returned. I found their tracks easily enough. 2 adults, 2 children around 10 years old, all wearing hiking boots. They led northwest, following what looked like a game trail. But alongside them were other prints. Large, humanoid footprints, easily 18 inches long. In ranger training, they teach us about pareidolia, the tendency to see patterns where none exist. When people claim to see big footprints, it's usually overlapping bear tracks, or erosion patterns, or hoaxes. I've explained this to countless hikers who come running with evidence. These were different. Perfect toe definition, clear midfoot, obvious arch, depth consistent with something weighing at least 500 pounds, and they were fresh, from yesterday's soft rain. I photographed them with my camera, placing my own boot beside one for scale. Then I followed both sets of tracks deeper into the forest. 2 miles later, I found the first anomaly. The family's tracks continued forward, but the large prints veered sharply left, up a nearly vertical slope that no human could climb without equipment. The impressions continued straight up, as if whatever made them simply walked up a 75-degree incline. I kept following the family's path. Their stride length increased gradually. They'd started walking faster, then running. The children's tracks sometimes dragged, suggesting the parents were pulling them along. 5 miles from their campsite, I found the father's satellite phone smashed against a rock. Deliberate, not dropped. And nearby, hanging from a branch at about 7 feet high, the mother's jacket, torn along one sleeve. My radio crackled again, making me flinch. Base to Thompson. Status update? I reported finding the campsite and the signs of the family moving quickly through the forest, but hesitated about mentioning the large tracks. Something held me back. If I reported big footprints, I'd have search and rescue rolling their eyes, thinking I was wasting time on folklore while a family was missing. I'm tracking them northwest from their site. They appear to be moving quickly. Request additional teams to spread out from my position. Copy that. Helicopter will be overhead within 2 hours, weather permitting. Teams deploying from North Access Road. As I put the radio back on my belt, I heard it again. 3 knocks, closer this time. Then from another direction, an answering series of knocks. I froze, straining to listen. A child's voice called out, distant but clear. "Hello? Is someone there?" I shouted back. "Park Service, stay where you are," and broke into a run toward the sound. I found the 2 Sullivan children huddled in a shallow cave formed by fallen trees. The girl, about 12, held her younger brother protectively. Both were dirty, scratched, but largely unharmed. "Where are your parents?" I asked, dropping to a knee beside them. "They told us to hide," the boy whispered, when the tall man came. "What tall man?" I asked, pulling out my first aid kit to check them for injuries. The girl looked past me, into the trees. "The one that's watching us right now." I turned sharply. The forest appeared empty, but the feeling of being observed was overwhelming. I handed the children water and energy bars while Trying to raise base camp on the radio. Static answered me. We need to move, I said, helping them to their feet. Can you tell me what happened to your parents? As we began walking south, back toward established trails, the girl spoke softly. Dad saw big footprints yesterday and followed them. Last night something started throwing rocks at our tent, not hitting it, just around it, like it was trying to scare us. Dad grabbed the satellite phone and said we needed to leave. We started walking, but Mom kept saying something was paralleling us through the trees. She paused, grip tightening on her brother's hand. Then Dad saw it, really tall, covered in dark hair. He yelled at Mom to take us and run while he tried to call for help. We ran, but it cut through the forest and got ahead of us somehow. Mom pushed us toward that fallen tree and told us to hide and be quiet, no matter what we heard. Then she ran in another direction, screaming to draw it away. When was this? I asked. Last night. We heard Mom yelling for a long time, getting farther away. Then nothing. The knocking sounds came again, now from 3 different directions, surrounding us. We need to move faster, I said, lifting the exhausted boy onto my back. Keep close to me. We hadn't gone 50 yards when we found the father's backpack hanging from a branch, 12 feet off the ground. The helicopter thundered overhead just as we reached a clearing large enough for visibility. The children and I waved frantically until the pilot acknowledged us with a dip of the nose. Within 20 minutes, a rescue team reached our position, and the children were safely handed off for medical evaluation. What about our parents? The girl asked as a medic wrapped a thermal blanket around her shoulders. We'll find them, I promised, which was true. I just didn't say in what condition I expected to find them. Search Coordinator Ellis, a 20-year veteran of mountain rescue, pulled me aside as the children were led away. Thompson, what the hell happened out here? Those kids are talking about a tall man stalking their family. I hesitated. I found unusual tracks following the family's trail. Large, humanoid prints. Ellis's expression shifted from concern to annoyance. Bear prints, you mean? Probably a black bear curious about humans in its territory. These weren't bear tracks, I insisted. I've been ranging these forests for over 2 decades. I know the difference. And I know traumatized kids can say crazy things. And tired rangers can misinterpret evidence, he countered. We've got search teams spread across 5 miles. Stick to the facts, not campfire stories. He assigned me to Team 3, continuing the search for the parents along the northwest vector. 4 of us moved through the forest in standard search formation, calling out periodically and listening for responses. Another ranger, Diaz, fell into step beside me. I heard you found weird footprints, she said quietly. Like the ones Manning reported last year in Olympic National? I glanced at her. You believe that report? She shrugged. Manning quit after 20 years and moved to Arizona, never went camping again. Something happened to him out there. We walked in silence for a while before she spoke again. My grandmother was Snohomish. She called them Stetekai, the forest people. Said they were guardians who became angry when humans disrespected the wilderness. Her own father claimed to have been taken by them as a child and returned days later. You think that's what happened to the Sullivan parents? I don't know, but I know these mountains had names and stories long before we started drawing maps and building ranger stations. As afternoon faded toward evening, we found a man's boot beside a stream, then scraps of torn clothing. The evidence painted a clear picture of someone running desperately through rough terrain. We pushed on as light failed, switching to thermal imaging equipment. That's when we heard the scream. Not quite human, not quite animal. A long, undulating howl that echoed through the valley and sent birds exploding from the canopy. The 4 of us froze, instinctively moving into a defensive circle. Mountain lion? Suggested Taylor, the youngest ranger on our team. No way, Diaz whispered. That was no cat. Our team leader Parker raised his radio. Team 3 to base. We heard an unidentified vocalization approximately half-mile northwest of our position. Request permission to investigate. Negative, Team 3. Lights failing. Return to base camp. We resume at dawn. Parker hesitated, looking at us. Standard protocol was clear. Night searches were dangerous and largely ineffective unless there was imminent threat to life. There could be survivors, I said. Or we could have 4 more missing persons by morning, Parker countered. We follow protocol. As we turned back, I saw something move at the edge of my thermal scope's range. A large heat signature, upright, at least 7 feet tall. I raised the scope, but it had vanished between the trees. Could you see that? I asked Diaz. She nodded slightly, her expression grim. Like I said, my grandmother had stories. That night at the base camp, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the Sullivans, possibly still alive, waiting for rescue that was retreating to safety. I remembered the books in my cabin, folk tales collected from indigenous tribes throughout the Pacific Northwest, accounts from early settlers, modern encounter reports. There were patterns across centuries of stories, consistent details that couldn't be coincidence. Shortly after midnight, I made my decision. I gathered emergency supplies, left a note explaining my actions, and slipped away from camp. I was going back out. Protocol be damned. The forest at night is a different world. Familiar landmarks transform, distances stretch, and sounds carry differently through the cool air. I moved silently, using only red-filtered light to preserve my night vision. The Sullivan parents had been missing for over 36 hours now. Exposure alone would be a serious threat, not to mention injuries or whatever had been stalking them. I reached the location where we'd heard the scream and methodically worked outward in expanding circles. An hour in, I found fresh disturbance, broken branches, disturbed earth, signs of something large moving through the underbrush. Following this trail, I discovered what appeared to be a primitive structure deep in a ravine. Tree limbs had been woven between standing trunks, creating a crude shelter about 8 feet tall. Around it, smaller trees had been bent and twisted into patterns that couldn't have occurred naturally. Whatever this was, it hadn't been built by casual hikers or hunters. As I approached cautiously, my light caught something reflective, a woman's watch hanging from a branch, the crystal cracked but still glinting. Mrs. Sullivan's, almost certainly. I drew my sidearm, standard issue for wildlife defense, and moved closer to the structure. The entrance was a low opening, requiring me to crouch. The smell hit me first, a powerful musky odor unlike anything I'd encountered before. Not decomposition, thankfully, but deeply animalistic. Inside, my light revealed a dirt floor lined with vegetation. No fire pit, no tools. But pressed into one wall were obvious handprints, massive handprints with 5 distinct fingers, imprinted into clay-like soil. Something rustled behind me. I spun around, weapon raised. Mrs. Sullivan lay half-conscious in the corner, partially covered with branches and leaves. She was pale, hypothermic, but alive. No obvious injuries beyond scrapes and bruises. "Mrs. Sullivan," I whispered, holstering my weapon and rushing to her side. "I'm with the Park Service. We're going to get you out of here." Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused. "It took David," she mumbled. "Carried him away." "Your husband? When?" "Last night. It brought us here, kept watching us, left food, berries, raw fish, then took him." Her voice was hoarse, barely audible. "It's intelligent. It understood when I cried about my children." I gave her water, wrapped her in my emergency blanket, and tried calling for backup. The radio returned only static. We were too deep in the ravine. "Mrs. Sullivan, can you walk? We need to move to higher ground." She nodded weakly. I helped her to her feet, supporting most of her weight as we made our way out of the structure. The night had grown preternaturally still. No wind, no animal sounds, just our labored breathing as we climbed slowly out of the ravine. A branch snapped loudly behind us. I turned, shining my light between the trees. Nothing visible, but the feeling of being watched had intensified. "It's coming back," Mrs. Sullivan whispered, terror sharpening her voice. "Keep moving," I urged, one step at a time. We'd nearly reached the ridge when 3 distinct knocks echoed through the forest. So close they seemed to surround us. Mrs. Sullivan stumbled, nearly falling. "That's how they communicate," she gasped. "They've been doing that since it took us." "They?" I asked, helping her over a fallen log. "There's more than one." As if in confirmation, answering knocks came from multiple directions, a complex pattern, almost like language, too coordinated for any known wildlife behavior. We crested the ridge, and I immediately tried the radio again. This time I got through. "Emergency, this is Ranger Thompson. I've located Mrs. Sullivan alive. We're approximately 3 miles northwest of yesterday's final search position. Subject is ambulatory but requires immediate medical attention. We are being pursued. Repeat, we are being pursued." "Copy that, Thompson," came the response, barely audible through static. "Stay in position. Helicopter deploying with spotlight. ETA 15 minutes. "Negative," I replied. "Cannot remain stationary. We'll move toward clearing at coordinates 48.73 by -121.18. Mark with flares." I helped Mrs. Sullivan continue forward, both of us jumping at every sound. The knocking had stopped, but something large was moving parallel to us through the trees, just out of sight, but audible as branches swayed and undergrowth crushed beneath heavy steps. "What about David?" Mrs. Sullivan asked, her voice stronger now as adrenaline took effect. Search teams will keep looking, I assured her, though privately I doubted her husband was still alive. We'd covered perhaps half a mile when something massive stepped onto the path ahead of us. My light caught only a glimpse before it moved. A wall of dark hair, at least 8 feet tall, bipedal. It made no sound as it crossed the trail, but I caught the distinct impression of eyes reflecting my light. Mrs. Sullivan froze, her fingers digging into my arm. "That's not the one that took us," she whispered. "That one was smaller." Before I could process this information, rocks began to hit the ground around us, not thrown directly at us, but close enough to create an unmistakable pattern of threat. They were trying to hurt us, I realized. Away from the clearing, back toward the ravine. I fired a warning shot into the air, hoping the sound would discourage them. The forest fell silent momentarily, then erupted in response, howls and screams from multiple sources, a cacophony of inhuman voices communicating what could only be rage. "Run," I told Mrs. Sullivan, pulling her toward the clearing. "Don't stop." We crashed through the underbrush, abandoning stealth for speed. Behind us, I could hear heavy footfalls gaining ground. Something dark moved in my peripheral vision, keeping pace effortlessly. The trees thinned ahead, revealing stars. The clearing. Just 50 more yards. Something caught my pack, yanking me backward with incredible force. I slipped the straps, shoving Mrs. Sullivan forward. "Keep going. Signals ahead." I turned, raising my weapon, and found myself face to face with what decades of scientific consensus insists doesn't exist. 8 feet of muscular, hair-covered humanoid. Broad shoulders, massive limbs, a sloped head set directly on those shoulders with no visible neck, and eyes, deeply intelligent eyes studying me with what I can only describe as calculated assessment. It reached for me with hands larger than dinner plates, fingers splayed. I fired. The shot echoed through the forest. The creature recoiled, not from injury, I'm certain the bullet missed, but from the sound and muzzle flash. It retreated into the darkness, disappearing with improbable silence for something so large. I backed away, keeping my weapon raised, and ran for the clearing. Mrs. Sullivan had reached it already and was waving a flare I'd given her. The red glow illuminated her exhausted but determined face. The helicopter appeared minutes later, spotlight cutting through the forest canopy to find us. As its runners touched down, I looked back toward the tree line. 3 pairs of eyes reflected the aircraft's powerful light, watching, assessing, remembering. We lifted off, Mrs. Sullivan already receiving medical attention from the paramedic on board. Below us, the creatures kept pace with the helicopter for nearly half a mile before the aircraft's speed finally outmatched them. "You saw them too, right?" Mrs. Sullivan asked, clutching my hand with surprising strength. "Tell me I'm not crazy." "I saw them," I confirmed quietly, so only she could hear. "David always wanted to find Bigfoot," she said, tears filling her eyes. "He read every book, followed all the online forums. That's why he followed those tracks. He was so excited. When we landed at the command post, everything became a blur of activity. Mrs. Sullivan was whisked away to a waiting ambulance. I gave a preliminary report, carefully omitting any mention of bipedal creatures or woven structures. Instead, I described finding Mrs. Sullivan disoriented in the forest, likely having wandered in her hypothermic state. I reported hearing large wildlife moving through the area, possibly bears, and rocks falling from ridgelines. Search coordinator Ellis gave me a long look. "Diaz said you took off in the middle of the night against direct orders." "I had a hunch about the ravine system," I replied. "Turns out I was right." "And the pursuit you reported on the radio?" "Wildlife. Bear, probably." Mrs. Sullivan was delirious from exposure. Ellis studied me, then nodded slowly. "Get some rest. Full debrief at 0800. We're still looking for the husband." I knew they wouldn't find him. 3 days later, the search for David Sullivan was officially classified as a recovery operation rather than a rescue. Teams found scattered personal items, his jacket, 1 boot, his wallet, but no body. The official report cited animal predation as the probable cause of death, with remains likely scattered by scavengers. Mrs. Sullivan and her children relocated to Colorado after the incident. Before leaving, she visited my cabin. "I told them bears attacked us," she said, sitting stiffly at my small table. "That David sacrificed himself so I could escape. No one would believe the truth." "I know," I replied. "I've been thinking about how long they've been out there. How many missing hikers over the decades might be attributed to them." "They're not just animals," she said with certainty. "The one that took us, it brought food, made sure we had water, When I showed it pictures of my children and cried, it left and returned with the watch I'd given my daughter for her birthday, like it was telling me they were safe. But it still took your husband. Her eyes dropped. David tried to escape, attacked it with a rock. I think they have territories, rules, consequences for defiance. After she left, I dug out the camera with the footprint photos, only to find the memory card corrupted. My written report mentioned no structures, no handprints in clay, no bipedal creatures tracking us through the forest. Some truths don't belong in official records. But I began researching in earnest. Indigenous legends spanning centuries, early settler accounts, modern encounters documented in obscure journals and online forums, consistent descriptions of behavior, physical characteristics and communication methods. The wood knocks, the rock throwing, the strategic intelligence. 6 months later, I received a package from a university anthropologist who'd interviewed the Sullivan children. Inside was a child's drawing. Tall, hair-covered figures with long arms surrounding a family. One figure was extending what appeared to be berries toward the humans. The note accompanying it read simply, "The children's therapist says, this isn't trauma fantasy. What did you really see out there, Ranger Thompson?" I never replied, but I requested permanent assignment to Outpost 17. 5 years have passed since the Sullivan incident. I'm still at Outpost 17, turning down promotions that would take me to more developed areas. My cabin walls are now covered with maps marking disappearances, sightings, and unusual discoveries. String connects similar accounts across decades. The Forest Service thinks I'm eccentric but effective. My rescue success rate is unusually high because I know where to look, and more importantly, where not to look. Which ravines to avoid, which ridges are boundaries, the territories I've mapped through careful observation. I leave offerings now, dried fruit, honey, at specific boundary markers, not as superstition but acknowledgement, respectful distance. When hikers go missing, I find them faster by thinking like something that knows these forests better than any human could. 3 nights ago, I awoke to 3 distinct knocks on my cabin wall. Outside, I found fresh tracks in the snow leading to the tree line, and a crudely woven structure of branches and twigs. Examining it in the dawn light, I realized it was a miniature replica of my cabin, down to the chimney and porch. A message, perhaps a warning, perhaps recognition. That evening, I placed a similar structure at the forest edge, acknowledging receipt of their communication. By morning, it had been taken. I'm retiring next month. My replacement arrives next week for training. I've prepared the official documentation, the patrol routes, the emergency protocols, all the things a ranger needs to know. But there's another set of notes hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Information about territories and boundaries, communication methods, the true meaning of different woodknock patterns, the significance of twisted trees and rock arrangements. Knowledge earned through careful observation and respectful distance. I'll watch my replacement carefully. If they seem ready, if they demonstrate respect for the forest and its secrets, perhaps I'll share what I've learned. Perhaps they too will earn silent guardians who parallel their patrols, occasionally visible at the corner of vision before melting into ancient shadows. Because the truth I've come to understand is this: we've never been alone in these forests. We've never been the only intelligent species walking these mountains. The difference is that they know everything about us, while we've barely acknowledged their existence. They watch. They remember. They communicate across vast distances. They have culture, territories, rules, and they've been here long before us. When hikers vanish without trace, when experienced outdoorsmen report strange encounters, when children draw pictures of tall watchers in the trees, we dismiss it as fantasy or misidentification. We file it away, find rational explanations, move on. But out here, in the deep wilderness where cell phones fail and ancient trees block the sun, rationality has different boundaries, different truths emerge. I leave my maps and notes for whoever comes next. Whether they believe will be their choice. Whether they're worthy of the knowledge will be for the watchers to decide. As for me, I've purchased a small cabin 50 miles north of here. Not quite civilization, not quite wilderness. A respectful distance, close enough to hear 3 knocks on my wall when something significant happens in the forest. Close enough to maintain the equilibrium I've helped establish in my small corner of the wilderness. Because I know now what most will never accept. We've been sharing these mountains all along with something ancient and intelligent. Something that watches, remembers, and occasionally, when humans venture too far into places they shouldn't, enforces boundaries older than our written history. They took David Sullivan. They could have taken his entire family. They could have taken me on multiple occasions. But they didn't. There's wisdom in these mountains, moving on 2 legs through shadows. watching, waiting, protecting territories we claim to manage but barely understand. And sometimes, late at night when the forest falls unnaturally silent, I wonder if they're studying us as intensely as I've studied them. Learning our habits, our weaknesses, our capacity for destruction. I wonder what conclusions they've reached. I listen for knocks in the darkness, and I always answer. The first thing that hits you when you arrive in the Alaskan backcountry is the silence. Not the absence of sound. There's plenty of that in the rustling leaves, the distant calls of birds, the soft lapping of water against rocky shores. It's the absence of human noise that creates a vacuum, a void that seems to swallow you whole. My name is Dakota, meaning friend to everyone in Sioux. My grandmother was half Sioux, and I'd always felt connected to that part of my heritage. The name felt like an ironic choice for someone seeking solitude, but perhaps that's exactly why I chose this posting at Midnight Lake Ranger Station. After 8 years in the Marines, followed by 3 as a police officer in Seattle, I needed space, distance, and time to breathe. The ranger station was more isolated than I'd anticipated. A sturdy log cabin nestled between towering pines, overlooking a vast, mirror-like lake that reflected the mountains beyond. My nearest neighbor was 40 miles south. Cell service was non-existent. Radio contact with headquarters was scheduled twice daily, more in emergencies. "You'll be monitoring 210,000 acres, Supervisor Redford had told me during my briefing in Anchorage. Your primary duties include tracking wildlife populations, assisting any hikers in distress, monitoring for illegal activities, and reporting environmental changes. Most days, you won't see another human soul." That sounded perfect to me. After my last tour in Afghanistan and the chaos of urban policing, the wilderness offered a sanctuary. No explosions, no gunshots, no screaming. Just me, the wildlife, and endless forests beneath the vast Alaskan sky. I spent my first week settling in, organizing supplies, studying maps, and familiarizing myself with the terrain immediately surrounding the station. The cabin was well equipped, solar panels for basic electricity, a powerful radio system, a wood stove for heat, and enough shelf-stable food to last months if necessary. Fresh water came from a natural spring nearby, filtered through a system beneath the cabin. It was on my 8th day that I found the first tracks. I'd been hiking along the eastern shore of the lake, marking locations for future wildlife cameras, when I spotted them in a muddy section of the trail. Footprints, large, humanoid footprints, pressed deep into the soft earth. Too big for a human, too structured for a bear. My first thought was practical. Someone was playing a hoax. Maybe local teenagers with carved wooden feet attached to their boots, a common trick used by Bigfoot enthusiasts. But the nearest town was over 80 miles away, and these tracks showed a stride length that would be difficult to fake. The impressions were fresh, no more than a few hours old. I photographed them, measured them, and made notes. 18 inches long, 8 inches wide at the ball of the foot, 5 clearly defined toes, a stride length of approximately 70 inches, suggesting something over 7 feet tall. Just a bear walking on its hind legs, I told myself, though the shape was all wrong. Bears have elongated foot pads and their tracks show claw marks extending beyond the toes. These had none of those characteristics. That night, I reviewed the historical reports for the region. Nothing specific about Bigfoot sightings, but several mentions of hikers reporting unusual noises and feeling watched. 3 missing persons cases in the past decade, all unsolved. One ranger had quit suddenly 5 years ago, citing personal reasons after only 2 months on the job. I told myself this was exactly why I'd taken this position, to investigate, to observe, to understand the wilderness and its secrets. But as darkness fell and the wind picked up, rattling the windows of my cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from the tree line, silently observing my movements through the illuminated windows. I checked my sidearm, a Glock 20 loaded with 10mm rounds, standard issue for rangers in bear country, and placed it on my bedside table before turning in for the night. The sound that woke me came just after 3 a.m. A long, low howl that wasn't quite wolf, wasn't quite human. It echoed across the lake, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. It came again, closer this time, followed by what sounded like heavy wood knocking against wood, 3 distinct impacts. I grabbed my flashlight and gun and moved to the window. The night was clear, a 3/4 moon casting silver light across the landscape. Nothing moved in the visible terrain, but the feeling of being watched intensified. The radio crackled suddenly, making me jump. Static filled the room, broken by what sounded like heavy breathing. I approached cautiously, adjusting the frequency, trying to establish contact with anyone who might be out there. "This is Midnight Lake Ranger Station. Does anyone copy?" I said, keeping my voice steady. The breathing continued for 10 more seconds, then stopped abruptly. The radio went dead. I spent the remainder of the night seated by the window, watching the tree line, my gun in hand. As dawn broke, exhaustion finally pulled me into an uneasy sleep. When I woke, I convinced myself I'd overreacted. Wildlife could make strange sounds. The radio interference was likely just atmospheric disturbance. The tracks were probably from a deformed bear or moose. There were logical explanations for everything. I reported the tracks during my scheduled radio check, describing them as unusual wildlife prints, possibly ursine but with abnormal characteristics. Headquarters acknowledged without much interest, suggesting I set up game cameras if I wanted to identify the species. Over the next few days, I installed 6 motion-activated cameras at strategic points around the lake and cabin. If anything was out there, I would capture evidence. I told myself this was standard procedure, not an admission that I believed in cryptids or monsters. But each night, the sounds returned. Sometimes distant howls, sometimes the wood knocking. And twice, what sounded like heavy footsteps circling the cabin. I never saw anything when I looked outside. But each morning I found new tracks, always keeping just beyond the range of my cameras, as if whatever made them knew exactly where I'd placed them. Then came the night of the storm, when everything changed. When I learned why the previous ranger had really left, and why the native tribes of the region called this area the place where shadows walk. The storm rolled in from the north, a massive front of dark clouds that swallowed the afternoon sun and plunged the forest into premature twilight. The wind picked up rapidly, bending the tall pines and sending waves crashing against the lakeshore. I'd been tracking the weather reports and knew it would be intense. 60-mile-per-hour gusts, potential for hail, several inches of rain. I secured the exterior of the cabin, brought in extra firewood, and prepared for a long night. By 7 p.m., the storm was directly overhead. Lightning split the sky in blinding flashes, followed by thunder that shook the cabin's foundation. Rain pounded against the roof in steady sheets, occasionally punctuated by the sharp impacts of hail. The electricity flickered and died, leaving me with emergency lanterns and the glow of the wood stove. I attempted radio contact with headquarters but received only static. The storm had knocked out communications. I was completely isolated. At approximately 9:30 p.m., between claps of thunder, I heard a sound that didn't belong, a sharp crack, like a tree splitting, followed by a heavy thud against the east wall of the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and sidearm and peered through the window. The beam cut through sheets of rain but revealed nothing unusual. Then it came again, a deliberate thud, this time against the door. My training kicked in. I positioned myself with a clear view of the entrance, weapon ready, and called out, "This is Park Ranger Dakota. Identify yourself." No response except another impact, harder this time, making the door shudder in its frame. "I am armed," I warned. "Identify yourself immediately." The pounding stopped. For several long seconds, the only sounds were the storm and my own breathing. Then, from just outside the door, came a low, rumbling sound. Not quite a growl, not quite speech, but something between the two. It raised the hair on my neck and sent a chill through my body despite the heat from the stove. I reached for the radio again, desperate for contact with the outside world. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Midnight Lake Ranger Station. Does anyone read me?" To my shock, the radio responded not with a human voice, but with the same rumbling sound that came from outside the door, perfectly mimicking my call for help. Something scraped against the window to my right, long, curved marks appearing in the condensation. I swung my light toward it and caught a glimpse of movement, a massive shadowy figure retreating from the glass. The logical part of my brain still sought rational explanations. A bear, a moose, perhaps even a disturbed individual who'd wandered far from civilization. But deep down I knew it was none of these. The calculated movement, the mimicry, the deliberate avoidance of my cameras. This was something else. For over an hour it circled the cabin, occasionally striking the walls or making that terrible rumbling sound. I tracked its movement, keeping my distance from the windows and doors, weapon ready. During one particularly bright lightning flash, I saw it clearly for the first time, a massive silhouette, at least 8 feet tall, broad-shouldered and covered in dark hair. It moved with a fluid grace that belied its size, disappearing into the trees before I could raise my weapon. Around midnight, the assault on the cabin stopped abruptly. The storm continued to rage, but the presence outside had vanished, or at least retreated. I maintained my vigilance until dawn, dozing in short bursts with my back to the wall, gun in hand. When morning finally came, the storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed. Fallen trees, scattered branches, and pools of standing water surrounded the cabin. I cautiously ventured outside, sidearm holstered but within easy reach. The evidence was undeniable. Deep footprints circled the entire perimeter, identical to those I'd found by the lake. Claw marks scored the wooden exterior of the cabin in several places. Most disturbing of all, one of my wildlife cameras had been torn from its mounting on a nearby tree and crushed, its memory card missing. I photographed everything, collecting evidence methodically despite my shaking hands. When radio contact with headquarters was re-established, I reported significant storm damage and evidence of large predator activity near the station, stopping short of describing what I'd actually experienced. That afternoon, while checking other cameras, I found something that changed everything. The camera positioned farthest from the cabin, overlooking a small clearing, had captured 3 images before its battery died. The first showed nothing but the empty clearing. The second, triggered 2 minutes later, showed the same view, but with a dark figure at the very edge of the frame, partially obscured by foliage. The third image, taken seconds after the second, was mostly blurred, as if the camera had been knocked askew in the moment of capturing. But in the corner was a clear image of a massive, hair-covered hand with long, curved nails. I sat by the lake that evening studying the photographs and contemplating my options. I could report everything, risk being labeled unstable, and likely be reassigned. I could continue documenting the phenomena, gathering evidence of something that most scientists insisted didn't exist, or I could leave, as the previous ranger had done. As dusk approached, bringing with it the vulnerability of another night, I made my decision. I would stay. This was why I'd come to the wilderness, not just to escape human chaos, but to connect with something primal, something beyond ordinary understanding. I returned to the cabin and made preparations. I rearranged the furniture to create clear lines of sight to all entrances. I checked and rechecked my weapon. I placed battery-powered alarms near each window and door. As darkness fell, I reviewed the historical file I'd discovered hidden in the back of a filing cabinet that morning. The true report of the previous ranger, never officially filed. His meticulous notes described encounters nearly identical to mine, escalating over weeks until the night he fled the station in terror, abandoning most of his possessions. His final entry read, "It's not hunting me, it's studying me, learning from me. God help whoever comes next." Now, sitting in the same chair where he had written those words, I waited for night to fall completely, for the visitor I knew would return. The difference was, I wasn't planning to run. Through the window, I watched the first stars appear as twilight deepened into true darkness. From somewhere in the forest came the now familiar sound of wood striking wood. 3 times, a pause, then 3 times again. A greeting, a challenge, a summons. I checked my weapon one final time and stepped outside to answer. The forest at night is a different world. Shadows move with purpose. Familiar landmarks transform into looming sentinels, and distance becomes impossible to judge. I moved carefully away from the cabin, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The air was cool and still, heavy with the lingering moisture from the storm. The wood knocking had stopped, but I could feel a presence watching, evaluating my response to its call. Every instinct screamed for me to retreat to the safety of the cabin, but I pushed forward, driven by a need to understand what was happening at Midnight Lake. I reached the edge of the clearing where my camera had captured the partial image and stopped. The small meadow was bathed in moonlight, eerily beautiful and utterly still. I switched off my flashlight, allowing my eyes to adjust fully to the natural light. "I know you're there," I said, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. "I'm not leaving and I'm not afraid." The latter was a lie, but I needed to project confidence. From what I'd observed, this creature, whatever it was, responded to perceived weakness as any predator would. For long minutes, nothing happened. Then, from the trees to my left came a subtle movement, a shifting of shadows that gradually took form as a massive figure emerged, partly from the tree line. It stood at least 8 feet tall, its broad shoulders and powerful frame silhouetted against the night sky. Dense hair covered its body, but in the moonlight I could see its face more clearly than I'd expected. A flattened nose, deep-set eyes beneath a heavy brow ridge, and an expression that conveyed not mindless aggression but calculated assessment. My hand rested on my sidearm, but I didn't draw it. Somehow, I knew that escalating to violence would be a fatal mistake. "What do you want?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice from trembling. The creature made that rumbling sound again, but this time, embedded within it were what sounded like words. Distorted, guttural, but recognizable. "Why? Here." I blinked in shock. It was speaking, attempting human language with vocal anatomy never meant for such sounds. "I'm protecting this place," I answered carefully. "This is my home now." The creature tilted its head, those deep-set eyes studying me with unsettling intelligence. "Home. Before." Understanding dawned. "This was your home first," I said. "You were here before humans." It took a step forward, moonlight now fully illuminating its features. Despite its intimidating size and strength, I saw something unexpected in its expression. weariness, curiosity, and something that might have been recognition. Others, run. You, stay. Yes, I confirmed. I'm staying. What followed was the most extraordinary exchange of my life. Through its limited vocabulary, gestures, and sometimes drawings in the dirt, the creature, which I began to think of not as a Bigfoot, but as a remnant hominid, perhaps a surviving branch of ancient human relatives, communicated fragments of its reality. It was not alone. There were others, not many, living in the most remote regions. They had watched humans for centuries, occasionally interacting but mostly staying hidden, passing down knowledge of our habits and technologies through generations. They understood our weapons, our cameras, our structures. They knew how to avoid detection, how to disable our surveillance, how to create fear when they wanted to drive humans away. This particular individual seemed to be a sentinel of sorts, tasked with monitoring human encroachment into their territory. The previous ranger had been tested, as I had been, and had failed by fleeing. My willingness to engage, to step beyond the safety of human technology and meet this being on neutral ground, had changed the dynamic. As our rudimentary communication continued, I began to understand the true nature of Midnight Lake's isolation. It wasn't just a remote outpost, it was a borderland, a boundary between their world and ours, maintained through careful intimidation of those humans who ventured too close. "Why show yourself to me?" I asked. "Why not stay hidden?" The creature considered my question, then responded with surprising clarity. "Change. Coming. Humans. More. Need. Understand." I nodded slowly, processing the implications. Human development was expanding even into these remote areas. Their traditional strategy of avoidance and intimidation might not work much longer. Perhaps this was an attempt at establishing a different kind of relationship. Not friendship exactly, but mutual recognition and respect. "What happens now?" I asked. The creature gestured toward the cabin, then to the broader forest beyond. "You stay. We stay. Watch, learn, no hurt. A truce then, an understanding that we would share this territory, observe each other, perhaps even learn from each other, without violence." As dawn approached, the creature prepared to retreat deeper into the forest. Before leaving, it reached into a pouch-like fold of skin at its waist, and withdrew something small that glinted in the fading moonlight. It extended its massive hand, offering the object to me. I approached cautiously and accepted the gift. It was the missing memory card from my destroyed camera, bent but possibly still functional. "See," the creature said, pointing to the card, then to its own eyes. I understood. There were images on the card it wanted me to see. Perhaps of its community, its life, things it couldn't communicate through our limited exchange. It was entrusting me with knowledge that no other human possessed. As it turned to leave, I called out, "Do you have a name? Something I can call you?" The creature paused, then made a sound unlike any I'd heard before, a complex vocalization impossible to transcribe in human language. "I can't say that," I admitted. It seemed to consider this, then pointed to the lake, gleaming in the pre-dawn light, and made a simpler sound. "Water? Speaker?" "Watershed," I suggested, combining the concepts. The creature nodded once, accepting this approximation, then disappeared into the forest with surprising speed and silence for something of its size. I returned to the cabin as the first rays of sunlight broke over the eastern mountains, the memory card clutched tightly in my hand. Whatever it contained, proof of an undiscovered species, insights into an ancient culture, or something beyond my current understanding, would change everything. But I already knew I wouldn't share it with headquarters, with scientists, or with the world at large. The trust placed in me carried a responsibility to protect what might be the last truly wild beings on our planet. The borderland of Midnight Lake would remain just that, a place between worlds where understanding might grow, but slowly, carefully, on terms not dictated solely by human curiosity or ambition. That morning, I made my scheduled radio check with headquarters. When asked about storm damage and any unusual activity, I reported minimal issues and no significant wildlife encounters. I would continue my work as a ranger, fulfilling my official duties while honoring a deeper, unwritten obligation to maintain the boundary between worlds. As I settled into my chair with a cup of coffee, watching the mist rise from the lake's surface, I felt the weight of isolation lift for the first time since arriving. I was not alone in this wilderness, and while what awaited me might include moments of fear and uncertainty, it also promised something I'd never found in the human world, a genuine frontier of discovery, not just of an unknown species, but of what might be possible when different kinds of intelligence find ways to coexist. That night, and many nights after, the wood knocking returned. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 knocks. But now I understood it wasn't a warning or a threat. It was a conversation continuing in the darkness, between two sentinels guarding the same border from opposite sides.